Anime Autopsy here, and I need to have a conversation with you about the word foreshadowing, because I am genuinely concerned that we as a community have lost the plot on what this term actually means. Every single week, I see someone post a panel from chapter 47 next to a panel from chapter 1089 with a caption that says something like, "Oda is a genius. He planned this 20 years ago." And listen to me. I need you to sit down. I need you to take a breath. Because about 80% of the time, that post is complete and utter. And I say this with love. I say this as someone who has spent an embarrassing percentage of his adult life analyzing fictional pirates. But we need to establish some ground rules before we spend the next 2.5 hours going through the actual receipts, because if we don't define our terms, this whole video becomes meaningless. So let's talk about the difference between foreshadowing, retrofitting, and what I'm going to call prewriting, because understanding these three categories is the difference between appreciating Oda's genuine insanity and just being a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast. Foreshadowing, in the classical literary sense, is when an author intentionally plants information early in a narrative that will become significant later. The key word there is intentionally. The setup exists because the payoff was already planned. You put the gun on the mantelpiece in Act 1 because you know someone's getting shot in Act 3. This is storytelling 101, and most competent authors do this to some degree. But here's where it gets messy in the context of long-running serialized fiction, because weekly manga operates under conditions that would make most novelists have a complete psychological breakdown. You're drawing 60 to 80 pages a month. You're working with editors who have opinions. You're responding to fan reception. You're adjusting pacing based on magazine sales. The idea that anyone could maintain perfect intentional foreshadowing across 25 plus years of this grind is, on its face, absurd. Which brings us to the second category. Retrofitting is when an author takes something they wrote earlier, something that maybe didn't have a specific intended meaning at the time, and retroactively assigns it significance. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is, in fact, how most long-running manga actually operates, and there's nothing wrong with it as long as the retrofitted connection feels organic. The problem is that fans often can't tell the difference between retrofitting and genuine foreshadowing, and creators are generally not incentivized to clarify which is which because both make them look smart. Let me give you an example from outside the One Piece ecosystem, so I don't get accused of bias here. Naruto, the Toby reveal. For those who've blissfully forgotten, Toby was this goofy masked Akatsuki member who acted like comic relief until Kishimoto pulled the mask off and revealed he was actually Obito Uchiha, Kakashi's childhood friend who was supposed to be dead. Now, fans lost their minds over this. They pointed to all these moments where Toby's behavior allegedly hinted at his true identity, his obsession with Kakashi, his knowledge of certain events, the eye hole in his mask being on the same side as Obito's surviving Sharingan. Genius foreshadowing, right? Except here's the thing. Kishimoto has been pretty open in interviews that Toby's identity changed multiple times during the planning process. At various points, Toby was going to be Madara for real, or Izuna, or someone else entirely. The hints fans identified were largely either coincidental or retrofitted once the Obito decision was locked in. Does this make the reveal bad? Not necessarily. It landed emotionally for a lot of people. But it's not foreshadowing in the strict sense. It's a writer making earlier material work for a later decision. And this is fine. This is normal. This is how serialization usually functions. But then there's Eiichiro Oda, and this is where my mind-brain starts to hurt, because the man appears to operate in a third category that I genuinely don't have a proper academic term for, so I'm calling it prewriting. Prewriting is when an author knows the ending, knows the major plot points, knows the character reveals before they even start publishing. And then, rather than foreshadowing in the traditional sense of planting seeds, they're actually just writing the story in non-chronological order. The setup isn't a hint at a future decision. The setup is a fragment of a decision that was already made. The gun isn't on the mantelpiece because you plan to have a shooting later. The gun is on the mantelpiece because you've already written the shooting scene and you're working backwards to make sure the gun is visible when it needs to be. This sounds like a subtle distinction, but it fundamentally changes how we should read One Piece. Because if Oda is pre-writing, if he knew Gear 5 in 1997, if he knew Sanji was a prince before the Bharati arc ended, if he knew Brooke existed before Laboon showed up at Reverse Mountain, then One Piece isn't a story being told. It's a story being revealed. We're not watching Oda figure things out as he goes. We're watching him slowly lift a curtain he put up 2 decades ago. And the evidence for this is genuinely kind of terrifying. Let's go back to the beginning. Before Chapter 1 of One Piece ever hit the pages of Weekly Shonen Jump, Oda wrote 2 prototype one-shots called Romance Dawn. These are publicly available. You can read them. And what's fascinating is how much of the core One Piece DNA is already locked in. Luffy wants to be a pirate. He has a straw hat given to him by someone important. He has rubber powers. The tone, the irreverence, the sense of adventure, it's all there. But more importantly, in interviews and SBS columns from the very early volumes, Oda makes comments that in retrospect are deeply suspicious. In Volume 1's SBS, he talks about having the ending planned. Not vaguely gestures at it, talks about it like it's a fixed point. He mentions characters who won't appear for years. He makes jokes that only land if you assume he knows exactly where this is going. At the time, readers probably assumed this was standard author bluster. Every creator says they have a plan. But 27 years later, the receipts are piling up in ways that are difficult to explain as retrofitting. And that's what this video is actually about. We're not here to make a tier list of cool callbacks. We're not here to just go, wow, Oda sure is smart for 2.5 hours. We're here to build a case, a prosecutorial case, if you will, for the argument that One Piece is fundamentally different from its peers in terms of structural planning. That fictional pirate creator man didn't just foreshadow things. He pre-wrote a story that will probably end up being over 1,200 chapters long, and he's been executing on that blueprint since before most of his current readers were born. This is the thesis. This is what we're proving, and if I'm right, it changes how you should read every single panel of this manga going forward. Because nothing is throwaway, nothing is filler, everything is load-bearing. So let's get into the actual evidence. Let's talk about what makes Oda's planning process different from everyone else's. And let's establish exactly how high the bar needs to be before we're willing to call something genuine foreshadowing versus just a happy coincidence. Because I promise you, by the end of this, you're going to look at One Piece like it's a puzzle box that's been sitting in front of you for decades, and you're only just now realizing how many pieces were already in place. In 2017, Eiichiro Oda gave an interview that should have broken the collective mindbrain of the One Piece fandom, but somehow it just kind of slid past everyone. The man sat down, and with the casual energy of someone discussing their lunch order, confirmed that he has known the ending of One Piece since before the series began serialization. Not, I have a general idea. Not, I know the emotional beats. He knows the ending. The specific ending, the final scene. He's had it locked in since the late 90s. And when pressed on this, he didn't backpedal or add caveats. He talked about it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Of course, he knows the ending. How else would he write the story? And I need you to understand how absolutely unhinged this is in the context of weekly manga serialization, because this isn't how the industry works. This isn't how any of this is supposed to work. Weekly manga is, by its nature, a reactive medium. You publish a chapter. You see how readers respond. You adjust. Characters who pop get more screen time. Arcs that drag get cut short. Villains who land become recurring threats, while ones who flop get quietly shuffled off stage. This is the standard operating procedure, and it's why so many long-running series feel like they're being made up as they go along. Because they are. They literally are. The authors are sprinting on a treadmill that never stops, and the idea of maintaining a coherent multi-decade plan while also responding to weekly feedback is basically impossible. Except apparently, fictional pirate creator man didn't get that memo. Or he got it and he simply chose to be built different. Because the more you dig into how Oda actually works, the more you realize that his process is genuinely alien compared to his peers. Let's talk about the notebooks. Oda has mentioned in multiple SBS columns and interviews that he maintains physical notebooks, essentially a story Bible, where he keeps track of future plot points, character details, and revelations he's planning to deploy. This isn't unusual on its face. A lot of writers keep notes. But the way Oda describes it suggests something more comprehensive than a typical reference document. He talks about having ideas for characters years before they appear. He talks about seeding details in early chapters specifically so he can pay them off later. He describes his process less like, I'm figuring out what happens next, and more like, I'm deciding when to reveal the next piece of a puzzle I already completed. His editors have corroborated this. They've talked about Oda, showing them plans for arcs that were a decade away from publication. They've mentioned him referencing his notebooks to check continuity on details that readers had long forgotten. The man has a filing system for fictional pirate business, and he's been maintaining it since the Clinton administration. And then there's the anime evidence, which is circumstantial but deeply suspicious. The very first episode of the One Piece anime, which aired in 1999, contains a flash-forward sequence that wasn't in the manga. We see Luffy's execution platform moment from Logtown before we've even met most of the crew. We see Smoker. We see the storm. We see the smile. Now, the anime team at Toei has historically taken liberties with filler content. But this wasn't filler. This was a deliberate choice to open the anime with a scene from the future, which means someone at Toei knew this scene was coming, which means someone told them, which means Oda, in 1999, had already planned a scene that wouldn't appear in the manga until chapter 99, and he trusted the anime team enough to let them preview it. This is not how adaptations normally work. Anime studios don't usually get advance notice of plot points years down the line, but Oda apparently handed them a roadmap. Because he had a roadmap. Because the roadmap existed before episode 1 ever aired. But let's go even deeper, because the Logtown thing is impressive, but it's also relatively close to the beginning of the series. 100 chapters isn't that far to plan ahead. What about the really long-term stuff? What about the things Oda set up in the first 200 chapters that didn't pay off until we were past 1,000? This is where the prewriting theory gets genuinely hard to dismiss. Consider the fact that Oda introduced the concept of the Void Century, the world government's cover-up of an 800-year gap in history back in the Alabasta arc. Chapter 218. We're in the early 200s, and Oda is already laying groundwork for what is clearly the central mystery of the entire series. And here's the thing. He didn't just introduce the concept vaguely. He gave us specific details. He told us it was exactly 800 years. He told us the poneglyphs were the key. He told us someone was trying to uncover the truth, and someone else was trying to keep it buried. These aren't the vague gestures of a writer who's winging it. These are load-bearing structural elements that only work if Oda already knows what the Void Century contains. You don't establish an 800-year mystery in Chapter 218 unless you know the answer. You don't spend the next 900 chapters building toward that answer unless it was locked in from the start. The same logic applies to the Will of D. Oda introduces this concept absurdly early. We learn that Luffy's full name is Monkey D. Luffy, and that the D is significant basically before the grand line even starts. And then Oda proceeds to do something remarkable. He keeps the D completely consistent across over 1,000 chapters. Every D carrier smiles at death. Every D carrier has a connection to the void in history. Every D carrier is positioned as an enemy of the gods, whether they know it or not. This isn't something you can retrofit. Retrofitting creates inconsistencies. Retrofitting leaves gaps where the author forgot their own rules. But the D is airtight. It's been airtight for 27 years, which means Oda knew from the beginning exactly what the D means and exactly how every D carrier should behave. He's been writing to that specification since Goldie Roger smiled on the execution platform in Chapter 1. So here's where we land with the pre-writing theory. The claim isn't that Oda planned every single detail of One Piece in advance. That would be absurd. The man writes in jokes about current events. He clearly makes some decisions reactively. But the core architecture, the load-bearing walls of this narrative, those appear to have been drafted before serialization began. The ending is fixed. The major reveals are fixed. The thematic through lines are fixed. What Oda is doing week to week isn't inventing the story. He's decorating rooms in a house whose blueprints were finalized in 1997. And once you internalize this, once you accept that One Piece might literally be a pre-written story being serialized in slow motion, it changes everything. Every detail becomes potentially significant. Every throwaway line becomes a candidate for future payoff. Because if the ending is already written, then everything between Chapter 1 and that ending is connective tissue. And Oda, that obsessive, sleep-deprived, possibly clinically unwell genius, has been weaving that connective tissue for nearly 3 decades without dropping a single major thread. That's not foreshadowing. That's architecture. And we're only just starting to see the full shape of the building. Now that we've established the theoretical framework, I need to do something deeply unpopular. I need to be the guy who tells you that half the foreshadowing posts you've upvoted are actually garbage. I know. I know this makes me a killjoy. I know this makes me the person at the party who corrects someone's grammar. But if we're going to spend the next 2 hours going through the genuine receipts, we need to be absolutely ruthless about separating real evidence from pattern-matching nonsense. Because the One Piece fandom has a problem. We're so hungry to validate Oda's genius, so desperate to prove that our favourite manga is the most brilliantly constructed narrative in human history, that we've collectively lost the ability to distinguish between intentional setup and pure coincidence. And fictional pirate creator man deserves better than us crediting him for things he didn't actually do. So let's talk about what doesn't count as foreshadowing, and let's be specific about it, because I've seen all of these mistakes made repeatedly, and I need to exorcise them from the discourse. First up, reused visual motifs that don't connect to anything. Oda has a style. He has shapes he likes to draw. He has poses he returns to. He has background details that recur, because they're part of his visual vocabulary. Not every spiral is a reference to something. Not every skull is connected to Brooke. Not every character with sharp teeth is secretly related to Kaido. I have seen people draw lines between the most absurdly unrelated visual elements and declare it foreshadowing, and it drives me absolutely insane. There was a post a while back claiming that a random background character in Logetown was actually a young Doflamingo because they had similar sunglasses. They did not have similar sunglasses. They had sunglasses. That's it. That's the connection. 2 characters in a manga about pirates both wore eyewear that blocks the sun. This is not evidence. This is seeing the Virgin Mary in a piece of toast and declaring it a miracle. Oda draws thousands of characters. Some of them will coincidentally share design elements. This means nothing unless there's additional supporting evidence. Second, and this one is going to upset people, fan theories that got lucky are not foreshadowing. I need you to really sit with this one. If someone in 2008 posted a theory that Sanji was secretly royalty, and then Whole Cake Island happened, that doesn't mean Oda foreshadowed it. It means someone made a guess that happened to be correct. These are different things. Foreshadowing requires intentional setup by the author. A fan correctly predicting a plot point is not proof that the author planted clues. It's proof that the fan made a good guess. Now, sometimes these overlap. Sometimes fans correctly predict things because they picked up on genuine foreshadowing. But we need to be careful about working backwards from correct predictions and assuming the clues were always there. Sometimes the clues were there. Sometimes people just got lucky. And sometimes, and this is the uncomfortable one, sometimes Oda sees fan theories and incorporates them into the story, which means the prediction wasn't a prediction at all, but rather an influence. We don't like to talk about this possibility because it undermines the narrative of Oda as an omniscient planner, but it's naive to assume that a writer working in weekly serialization for nearly 3 decades has never been influenced by fan discourse. The man reads the internet. He knows what we're saying. Some of our theories have probably made it into the manga. This doesn't make the story worse, but it does mean we need to be careful about claiming foreshadowing when the causality might run in the opposite direction. Third, thematic resonance is not the same as plot foreshadowing. One Piece has themes: freedom, dreams, inherited will, found family. These themes recur constantly because they're what the story's about. When an early arc touches on a theme that a later arc also touches on, that's not foreshadowing. That's thematic consistency. It's good writing, but it's a different kind of good writing. Foreshadowing is specific. It's this exact detail connects to this exact reveal. Thematic resonance is general. It's these two moments share emotional DNA because they're part of the same story. I see people conflate these all the time. They'll point to Nami's backstory involving oppression and then point to the Fishman Island arc involving oppression and declare it foreshadowing. No, that's Oda exploring similar themes in different contexts. He didn't plant Arlong Park as setup for Fishman Island. He wrote 2 arcs that deal with related subject matter, because those subjects matter to the story he's telling. This is still impressive. This is still evidence of a coherent authorial vision. But it's not foreshadowing in the specific sense we're tracking. Fourth, and this is the big one, correlation is not causation and similarity is not connection. Just because 2 things look alike doesn't mean they're related. Just because 2 events share structural similarities doesn't mean one was setting up the other. The human brain is a pattern recognition machine that evolved to spot predators in tall grass, and it will find patterns whether they exist or not. This is called apophenia, and the One Piece fandom has it bad. We see connections everywhere because we want to see them. We want Oda to be a genius. We want the story to be perfectly constructed. So we unconsciously filter evidence to support that conclusion and ignore evidence that contradicts it. This is confirmation bias, and it's the enemy of actual analysis. If we want to prove that Oda's foreshadowing is genuinely exceptional, we need to be harder on the evidence than the average fan, not easier. We need to actively try to disprove connections before we accept them. We need to ask, could this be coincidence, before we declare it intentional? So what's our evidentiary standard going to be for the rest of this video? I'm glad you asked, because I've thought about this way too much. For us to count something as genuine foreshadowing, we need at least one of the following. Option 1 is author confirmation. Oda says in an SBS or interview that he planned this. This is the gold standard. It's rare, but when it happens, it's undeniable. Option 2 is timeline impossibility. The setup contains specific details that could only make sense if the payoff was already planned, not vague similarities. Specific, concrete details that have no explanation other than intentional planting. Option 3 is structural necessity. The setup only exists to facilitate the payoff. There's no other narrative reason for the detail to be included. It's not doing double duty. It's not world building. It's purely and specifically set up for something that comes later. If a claimed foreshadowing moment doesn't meet at least one of these criteria, I'm not counting it. I don't care how popular the post was. I don't care how many upvotes it got. I don't care if it makes me look like a hater. Because here's the thing. Oda has enough genuine, undeniable, completely airtight foreshadowing that we don't need to pad the list with maybes. The real stuff is impressive enough. We don't need to give him credit for accidents. So from here on out, we're operating under strict evidentiary rules. If it doesn't meet the standard, it doesn't make the cut. And what you're going to see as we go through the actual receipts is that even with this high bar, the list of genuine foreshadowing is still absurdly long. That's how good Oda actually is. He doesn't need us to exaggerate. So we've established what foreshadowing is, what it isn't, and what our evidentiary standard looks like. But now I want to zoom out and talk about something that I think gets overlooked in these conversations, which is the sheer mechanical reality of how Eiichiro Oda actually works. Because when people talk about Oda's foreshadowing, they often frame it as some kind of mystical genius. Like the man just has a superhuman brain that can hold decades of plot threads in perfect order through sheer cognitive force. And look, maybe there's some truth to that. Maybe Oda is just built different on a neurological level. But I think the more interesting and frankly more useful explanation is that Oda's foreshadowing isn't primarily a product of talent. It's a product of infrastructure. The man has systems, he has processes, he has physical, organizational tools that enable him to do what he does. And understanding those systems helps explain how any human being could possibly maintain narrative coherence across 27 years and counting. Let's start with the schedule, because the schedule is important context. Oda works on a weekly serialization cycle that would destroy most human beings. For the majority of One Piece's run, he was producing roughly 17 to 19 pages per week, every week, with minimal breaks. The man famously sleeps about 3 hours a night during production periods. He's been hospitalized multiple times for overwork. His editors have had to physically intervene to make him take breaks. This is not a healthy lifestyle. This is not something I'm endorsing. But it's important to understand because it means that whatever organizational systems Oda uses, they need to be robust enough to function even when he's operating on severe sleep deprivation. You can't maintain complex narrative threads through willpower alone when you're running on fumes. You need external systems that hold the information so your exhausted brain doesn't have to. And Oda has those systems. He's talked about them in various interviews and SBS columns over the years, usually in that casually terrifying way he has of describing insane work habits, like they're totally normal. The most famous is what fans have come to call the box of ideas or the notebooks. Oda maintains physical documentation of future plot points, character details, and reveals he's planning to deploy. This isn't a single notebook. It's apparently multiple notebooks, accumulated over decades, containing everything from major plot beats to minor character trivia. When he introduces a new character, he doesn't just design them for the current arc. He thinks about their backstory, their connections to other characters, their potential future relevance, and he writes it down. He commits it to paper so that 300 chapters later, when he needs to remember that this background character was actually set up for something, he has a reference. His editors have corroborated this system. There are accounts of editorial meetings where Oda pulls out his notebooks to check continuity on details that the editors themselves had forgotten. Imagine being an editor at Shueisha, professional keeper of manga canon, and having the author correct you by referencing notes he made 15 years ago about a character's blood type. This is apparently a regular occurrence. Oda's documentation is more comprehensive than the people whose literal job is to track this stuff. And this explains a lot about how One Piece's foreshadowing actually functions. It's not that Oda remembers everything. It's that Oda wrote everything down, and he has a system for retrieving that information when he needs it. But the notebooks are only part of the infrastructure. The other piece, and I think this is underappreciated, is Oda's character design process. Most manga artists design characters as needed. An arc requires a villain, so you design a villain. A new crew member joins, so you design their appearance. It's reactive. Oda apparently works differently. He designs characters years before they appear. He has sketches of characters sitting in folders, waiting for the right moment to deploy them. There are accounts of him showing editors' designs for characters who wouldn't appear in the manga for a decade. This means that when a character finally shows up in the story, Oda has potentially been thinking about them for years. He knows their deal. He knows how they connect to the larger narrative. He knows what role they're going to play in events that haven't been written yet. The character isn't being invented to serve the current arc. The character has been waiting in the wings, fully formed for their cue. This is why One Piece characters feel so coherent, even when they appear suddenly. Think about how Oda introduced the supernovas. This is a famous story in manga production circles. The 11 supernovas, this group of rookie pirates that would become massively important to the story's future, were allegedly designed in a matter of days, right before the Sabaody Archipelago arc. Oda needed to populate the island with notable rookies, so he cranked out nearly a dozen fully realized character designs in a compressed time frame. And yet every single one of those characters has remained consistent. Their personalities, their powers, their narrative roles, all of it has tracked perfectly across hundreds of chapters. Law went from background supernova to arguably the third most important character in the entire series, and there's been no retconning of his core design or personality. That's not luck. That's Oda doing intensive character development up front, even under time pressure, so that future Oda has a solid foundation to build on. The editor relationship is another piece of this infrastructure that deserves attention. Oda has worked with multiple editors over One Piece's run, and by all accounts, those editors serve as continuity checkers and sounding boards. When Oda proposes a plot development, the editors push back if it contradicts established canon. When Oda references something from 500 chapters ago, the editors verify that he's remembering it correctly. This is a collaborative process that helps catch errors before they reach publication. And while Oda clearly does the heavy lifting of maintaining the narrative vision, having professional support for continuity management is not nothing. Most authors working alone would inevitably make mistakes over this length of time. Oda has a team, even if it's a small one, helping him keep the threads straight. There's also evidence that Oda thinks about One Piece in terms of structure, rather than just sequential chapters. He's talked about planning in terms of sagas and arcs, understanding how individual chapters fit into larger narrative units. This structural thinking is crucial for foreshadowing because it means Oda isn't just asking what happens next, but how does this connect to the larger shape of the story? When you're thinking structurally, you naturally plant setups because you're aware of the payoffs they're building toward. You're not just writing Chapter 247. You're writing Chapter 247 as part of the Sky Pier arc, as part of the Sky Island saga, as part of the first half of the Grand Line, as part of the journey to Laugh Tale. Every level of that hierarchy informs what details belong in the chapter. So what's the takeaway here? I think it's that Oda's foreshadowing is less magical than it appears, and more the result of genuine professional discipline and organizational infrastructure. The man has been running a decades-long narrative project with the organizational rigor of a corporate enterprise. He has documentation. He has process. He has support staff. He has structural frameworks. None of this diminishes the achievement. If anything, it makes it more impressive, because it means this level of coherence is theoretically achievable by other creators, if they're willing to put in the infrastructural work. Oda didn't just stumble into being good at foreshadowing. He built systems specifically designed to enable foreshadowing at scale. And those systems have been running continuously for 27 years. That's the actual miracle, not the genius, the discipline. Here's an uncomfortable truth that I think we need to sit with before we move into the actual receipts. The foreshadowing discourse around One Piece isn't just about Oda. It's about us. It's about what we're looking for, what we want to find, and how our collective attention shapes which details get elevated to significance. Because foreshadowing doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in the interaction between what an author creates and what an audience notices. And the One Piece fandom is, for better or worse, one of the most obsessively detail-oriented audiences in all of fiction. We have created an environment where every panel gets scrutinized, every background detail gets analyzed, Every throwaway line gets catalogued and cross-referenced, and this environment affects the foreshadowing conversation in ways that are worth examining. Let's start with theory culture, because One Piece has one of the most developed theory ecosystems of any ongoing fiction. There are entire YouTube channels, entire subreddits, entire communities dedicated to predicting what Oda is going to do next. People spend hundreds of hours constructing elaborate theoretical frameworks based on scattered evidence throughout the manga. And some of these theories are genuinely impressive. Some of them have been proven correct. The existence of Gear 5 as a transformation connected to a mythological figure was theorized by fans before it was revealed. Sanji's royal heritage was speculated about for years before Whole Cake Island. The connection between Luffy's powers and the sun god Nika was floating around community discussions before Chapter 1044 dropped. These aren't lucky guesses in the sense of someone randomly throwing darts. These are the product of close reading, pattern recognition, and genuine analytical work. But here's where it gets complicated. When a theory gets proven correct, we retroactively elevate all the evidence that supported it to the status of foreshadowing. That panel people pointed to as proof? Now it's confirmed foreshadowing. That line of dialogue that seemed suspicious? Definitely intentional setup. But we don't apply the same scrutiny to theories that were wrong. We don't go back and examine all the evidence that supported the failed theories and ask why those details didn't actually mean anything. This creates a survivorship bias in the foreshadowing discourse. We remember the hits and forget the misses. We catalogue the predictions that landed and quietly bury the ones that didn't. And this makes Oda look more intentional than he might actually be, because we're only counting the times the pattern matching worked. I want to be clear that I'm not saying fan theories are worthless or that the community's analytical work is pointless. Far from it. I think the theory community is genuinely valuable, both as entertainment and as a form of collective close reading that surfaces details individual readers might miss. But I am saying that we need to be aware of how our own cognitive biases shape the foreshadowing narrative. Confirmation bias is real. We look for evidence that supports conclusions we already want to believe. We're emotionally invested in Oda being a genius because that validates our investment in the story. So we're predisposed to see foreshadowing everywhere, even when the connection might be coincidental. There's also a feedback loop here that rarely gets discussed. Oda reads the community. He's acknowledged this. He sees the theories. He knows what fans are speculating about. And while I don't think Oda changes major plot points based on fan theories, I think it's naive to assume the discourse has zero influence on his decisions. If fans are speculating about something and Oda was already planning to do that thing, he might lean into it harder, add more connective tissue, make the foreshadowing more explicit. Conversely, if fans guess something he was planning, he might adjust the execution to maintain some element of surprise. The relationship between creator and audience in a long-running serialized work isn't one-directional. It's a conversation, even if the audience's side of the conversation is filtered through social media posts and forum discussions rather than direct dialogue. This matters for how we evaluate foreshadowing claims, because it means the causal chain isn't always clear. Did Oda plant this detail in Chapter 200 because he was setting up a reveal in Chapter 1000? Or did fans notice the details start theorizing about it, and that theorizing influenced how Oda eventually paid it off? Both are possible. Sometimes both are probably true simultaneously, and distinguishing between them is often impossible because we don't have access to Oda's original notes or his decision-making process in real time. We only see the finished product, and we're reverse engineering intentionality from outcomes. The other thing worth noting is how fan attention creates significance. There are probably hundreds of details in One Piece that Oda intended as foreshadowing that nobody has noticed yet. Conversely, there are probably details that fans have elevated to foreshadowing status that Oda never intended as meaningful. The community's collective spotlight determines which details enter the discourse. A panel that gets screenshotted and shared becomes part of the foreshadowing canon. A panel that nobody posts about remains invisible, regardless of whether it was actually set up for something. This is why comprehensive analysis matters. If we only look at the famous examples, the ones that have already been elevated by community attention, we're getting a filtered view of Oda's actual foreshadowing practice. The real picture requires going back to the source material and looking with fresh eyes, not just aggregating the greatest hits that have already been identified. So where does this leave us as we transition into the actual evidence? I think it leaves us with a responsibility to be rigorous. We need to apply our evidentiary standards consistently, not just accept claims because they've achieved community consensus. We need to consider alternative explanations for apparent connections, not just assume intentionality. We need to be honest about the limits of what we can know and the ways our own biases might be shaping our conclusions. Because here's the thing. Even with all these caveats, even accounting for survivorship bias and confirmation bias and feedback loops and community attention effects, Oda still has an absolutely absurd amount of genuine, undeniable, airtight foreshadowing. The real stuff is so impressive that it doesn't need inflation. When we strip away the maybes and the probably coincidences and the fan pattern matching, what remains is still a body of evidence that no other manga creator can match. That's what we're about to examine. Not the greatest hits as filtered through community discourse, but the actual receipts, the specific chapters, the undeniable connections, the moments where the only possible explanation is that Oda knew, years or decades in advance, exactly where this story was going. We've spent this entire first saga establishing the framework. We've defined our terms. We've set our standards. We've acknowledged our biases. We've examined Oda's process. We've interrogated our own role in the foreshadowing discourse. All of that was necessary groundwork. But I know what you're actually here for. You're here for the proof. You're here to see the receipts laid out, one by one, with specific chapter citations and undeniable evidence. You want to see the moments where fictional pirate creator man looked directly into a camera that didn't exist yet and winked at future readers who hadn't been born. You want the stuff that makes your brain hurt when you realize how long ago it was planted. So let's give you what you came for. Let's open up the evidence locker and start pulling out exhibits. Let's talk about a whale, a skeleton, a prince, a god, and a man who hates dragons. Let's talk about the moments where foreshadowing stops being a theory and becomes undeniable fact. Let's get into the receipts. Let's start with the one that even the skeptics can't argue with, the one that gets brought up every single time someone asks for proof that Oda plans ahead. The one that spans nearly 400 chapters and connects a crying whale to a skeleton man with an afro. I'm talking about Laboon and Brooke, and I'm talking about why this example specifically breaks people's brains when they actually sit down and do the math on it. Because this isn't just good foreshadowing. This is Oda looking at his readers in the year 2000 and essentially saying, I'm going to introduce a plot thread right now that I won't resolve until 2008. And when I do resolve it, you're going to cry. And then he did exactly that. The absolute audacity of this man. Let's set the scene. Chapter 102. The Straw Hat crew has just entered the Grand Line. They've come down from Reverse Mountain, that ridiculous geographical feature where the oceans flow upward, and they encounter a lighthouse. Living at this lighthouse is an old man named Crocus, and living next to the lighthouse is a whale the size of a small island. This whale is Laboon, and Laboon is sad. That's the first thing we learn about him. This enormous creature is covered in scars, self-inflicted scars, because he's been ramming his head against the red line for decades. He's trying to break through the mountain. He's trying to get to the other side. And when Crocus explains why, we get our first piece of setup. Laboon is waiting for a pirate crew. 50 years ago, a group of pirates came through Reverse Mountain with a baby whale they'd befriended. They couldn't take the whale into the dangerous waters of the Grand Line, So they left him at the lighthouse with a promise. They told Laboon to wait. They told him they'd sail around the entire world and come back for him from the other side. And Laboon has been waiting ever since. Now, at this point in the story, this is a self-contained emotional beat. Luffy paints his Jolly Roger on Laboon's head, makes a new promise to come back and fight him, and the crew moves on. If you're reading this in 2000, you probably assume this is just a one-off, a touching moment that establishes the Grand Line as dangerous and sets up future emotional stakes for the Straw Hats' return journey. The pirate crew that abandoned Laboon! They're probably dead! That's the implication. 50 years is a long time. The Grand Line kills people. It's a tragedy, and Luffy's new promise is meant to give Laboon hope where his original friends failed. Story complete. Emotional beat landed. Move on. Except Oda wasn't done. Oda was never done. Because nearly 400 chapters later, in chapter 487, the Straw Hats meet a skeleton. His name is Brooke. He has an afro that he's very proud of, because someone once told him it looked nice. He can't eat because he's a skeleton, but he still asks to see women's underwear because he's a pervert. He's funny. He's weird. He plays piano. And then Oda drops the bomb. Brooke was a member of the Rumbar Pirates. The Rumbar Pirates were the crew that left Laboon at the lighthouse 50 years ago. Brooke is literally the last surviving member of the crew that made a promise to a baby whale in chapter 102. He's been dead for most of those 50 years, brought back by his devil fruit power, trapped in the Florian Triangle, waiting for someone to help him finish his journey. And the journey he needs to finish? Going back to Laboon, keeping the promise his crew made half a century ago. I need you to understand the timeline here, because the timeline is what makes this insane. Chapter 102 was published in 1999. Chapter 487 was published in 2007. That's 8 years of real-world time. That's nearly 400 chapters of manga. And during all of that time, Oda knew. He knew that the whale was going to connect to a major character. He knew that the pirates who abandoned Laboon weren't just background tragedy, but actual plot-relevant figures. He knew that one of them would join the Straw Hat crew. This isn't retrofitting. You cannot retrofit this. The details are too specific. The promise to return, the 50-year timeline, the crew entering from Reverse Mountain, all of it aligns perfectly with Brooke's backstory. Oda would have had to rewrite established continuity to make this work if he hadn't planned it. And there are no contradictions. Everything fits. Everything was always meant to fit. And it gets more specific than just the broad strokes. When we meet the Rumbar Pirates in Brooke's flashback, we see them singing. They're singing Binks's Suck, this pirate drinking song that becomes Brooke's signature piece. And here's the thing. Oda had already established the song's importance before Brooke ever appeared. The melody shows up earlier than Brooke's introduction. The thematic weight of music as a form of promise-keeping, as a way for the dead to speak to the living, it's all seeded before the reveal. When Brooke plays the last recording of his crew singing Binks's Sack together, that final message for Laboon, it lands as hard as it does because Oda spent years laying the groundwork. We knew the whale. We knew the weight. We knew the tragedy. Brooke's backstory doesn't just connect to Laboon. It recontextualizes Laboon as the emotional core of a storyline that was always going to be important. There's also the SBS confirmation, because this is one of the cases where Oda has actually admitted to the planning. In Volume 50's SBS, a reader asks about the connection between Laboon and Brooke. And Oda confirms that yes, this was intentional. Yes, he knew Brooke was coming when he introduced Laboon. Yes, the whole thing was planned from the start. This is author confirmation. This is the gold standard of evidence. We don't have to speculate about whether this was retrofitted because Oda straight up told us it wasn't. He knew in 1999 that a skeleton with an afro would join the crew in 2007, and that Skeleton's entire emotional arc would revolve around a whale the readers had already met. This is what I mean by prewriting. Oda didn't plant a vague seed and figure out what it meant later. He planted a specific seed with a specific payoff already determined. Laboon was never just a whale. Laboon was always Brooke's whale. The promise was always going to be kept. We just had to wait 8 years to see how. And the craziest part? This isn't even Oda's most impressive foreshadowing. This is just the example everyone agrees on, because the evidence is so undeniable. We're going to look at cases where the gap is longer, the details are more obscure, and the payoff is even more structurally ambitious. But Laboon and Brooke deserve to go first because they set the standard. They prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Oda plays games with timescales that would make other manga authors weep. 400 chapters, 8 years, 1 whale, 1 skeleton, 1 promise kept. If this is what fictional pirate creator man does with a side character, imagine what he's doing with the main plot. Actually, don't imagine it. We're about to show you. If Laboon and Brooke represent the gold standard of undeniable foreshadowing, then Sanji's secret royal heritage represents something arguably more impressive. A mystery that was hidden so well, buried under so many layers of misdirection and apparent gag content, that when it finally paid off, half the fandom had to go back and reread hundreds of chapters just to catch all the clues they'd missed. Because Oda didn't just foreshadow that Sanji was a prince, he told us Sanji was a prince, directly, to our faces, in the Alabaster arc. And we all thought it was a joke. We thought it was Sanji being Sanji, doing his suave secret agent bit, playing a role for the sake of drama. We were wrong. We were so incredibly wrong. And fictional pirate creator man was laughing at us the entire time. Let's go back to chapter 156. The Straw Hats are in Alabaster, trying to save a kingdom from Crocodile. Things are going badly. The crew has been captured or scattered. Crocodile is monologuing because that's what villains do. And then the Denden Mushi rings. Someone is calling Crocodile directly, taunting him, interfering with his plans. When asked to identify himself, this mystery caller gives a name. Mr. Prince. That's it. That's the alias. Sanji, the cook, the leg fighter, the man who has never once indicated any connection to royalty, introduces himself as Mr. Prince. And everyone, readers and characters alike, treats this as a bit, a performance. Sanji being theatrical because the situation calls for theatrical. The alias doesn't mean anything. It's just a cool thing to say when you're playing secret agent, except it means everything. Sanji is a prince, literally. His full name is Vinsmoke Sanji, and he's the 3rd son of the Vinsmoke family, rulers of the Germa kingdom. He's not playing at being a prince. He's stating a fact about himself, using the cover of irony to tell the truth without anyone taking it seriously. This is a technique in fiction called hiding in plain sight, and Oda executed it so perfectly that it took 15 real-world years for the payoff to arrive. 15 years. From chapter 156 in 2000 to the whole Cake Island arc beginning in 2016. That's not foreshadowing in the normal sense. That's Oda planting a time bomb and then sitting on the detonator for a decade and a half, waiting for exactly the right moment to press the button. But the Mr. Prince alias isn't even the most compelling evidence. Let's talk about the bounty poster, because the bounty poster is where this gets genuinely creepy. In chapter 174, we see the first bounty posters for the Straw Hats. Most of them feature photographs. Luffy's poster has a photo. Zoro's poster has a photo. But Sanji's poster has a drawing. A terrible drawing. A sketch that looks nothing like him. This becomes a running gag throughout the series. Sanji's bounty poster is always wrong, always unflattering, always somehow failing to capture his actual appearance. Readers assumed this was just comedy. Sanji is vain. Sanji cares about his image. Having a bad bounty poster is funny because it bothers him so much. Except there's a reason. A real plot-relevant reason that wouldn't be revealed for over a decade. Sanji's father, Vinsmoke Judge, didn't want his son to be identifiable. The Vinsmoke family had connections to the world government. They had political leverage. They had the ability to influence how bounties were issued and how information was distributed. The terrible sketch wasn't a coincidence or a gag. It was deliberate interference by Sanji's estranged family, keeping his face out of official records for reasons that only became clear when Whole Cake Island revealed the full scope of Vinsmoke political machinations. The poster eventually gets corrected, sort of, but even then it says, "Only alive," not dead or alive like normal bounties. Only alive. Because someone wants Sanji captured, not killed. Because someone has plans for him. Because his family has been tracking him this entire time, waiting for the right moment to drag him back into the world he escaped. And then, there's the eyebrow. This is the detail that makes foreshadowing obsessives lose their minds, because it's so subtle that most people didn't catch it until someone pointed it out after Whole Cake Island. Sanji's eyebrow curls in a specific direction. It's a distinctive visual trait. When we meet his siblings, the other Vinsmoke children, they all have curly eyebrows too. But here's the thing. Their eyebrows curl in the opposite direction from Sanji's. All of them. Every single Vinsmoke sibling has eyebrows that spiral one way, and Sanji's spiral the other way. This isn't an accident. This isn't Oda forgetting which direction he drew the curl. This is visual foreshadowing of the fact that Sanji is different from his siblings. He's the failed experiment, the one whose genetic modifications didn't take, the one who developed human emotions while his brothers became emotionless soldiers. His eyebrow curls the wrong way because he is, in the context of his family, wrong. He's the defect. And Oda was drawing that defect into his face from the very first time we saw him. We also have the North Blue detail, which is another piece of evidence that flew under the radar for years. Early in the series, there's a throwaway mention that Sanji is from the North Blue. This seems like a continuity error at first, because Sanji's backstory with Zeph and the Bharati takes place in the East Blue. How can he be from the North Blue if we saw his childhood in the East Blue? Readers assumed Oda made a mistake. He'd forgotten which sea he'd established for Sanji's origin. But Oda doesn't make those mistakes. Not with major characters. The North Blue origin wasn't an error. It was a clue. Sanji was born in the North Blue, in the Germa Kingdom, and later escaped to the East Blue, where he met Zeph. His backstory has two parts. The part we saw and the part that was hidden. And Oda knew about both parts when he made that mistake in the first place. The SBS columns add additional confirmation. In Volume 87, Oda explicitly discusses Sanji's backstory and confirms that elements of it were planned far in advance. He talks about the Vinsmoke family as a concept he'd been developing for a long time, waiting for the right arc to deploy them. He acknowledges the eyebrow detail and confirms it was intentional. He treats the whole thing as obvious, as if readers should have seen it coming, which is both validating and infuriating. Because no, Oda, we did not see it coming. You hid a prince inside a cook for 15 years and acted like we should have known. This example is important because it demonstrates a different type of foreshadowing than Laboon and Brooke. That case was about emotional continuity. This case is about hidden identity. Oda gave us a character, let us believe we understood him completely, and then revealed that we only knew half the story. The foreshadowing wasn't just setting up a future event. It was maintaining a secret. Every panel of Sanji before Whole Cake Island carries new meaning once you know the truth. Every joke about the bounty poster, every mention of his mysterious past, every time he refused to use his hands to fight, which connects to Vinsmoke combat philosophy in ways that retrospectively make perfect sense. Oda wasn't just telling a story, he was telling two stories simultaneously and only revealing the second one when he was ready. That's not foreshadowing. That's narrative architecture on a level that most writers can't even conceptualize, let alone execute. And Sanji's not even the protagonist. Imagine what Oda's been hiding about Luffy. Here's something that I think doesn't get enough credit in foreshadowing discussions. Probably because it's so foundational to One Piece that we've all just accepted it as normal. Oda introduced observation haki in 2003. He formally named and explained haki in 2010. That's a 7-year gap where readers were looking at a core power system, watching characters use it, trying to understand the rules, And Oda just refused to tell us what it was actually called or how it actually worked. This is either the most confident world-building decision in manga history or the most reckless, and given how cleanly it paid off, I'm going with confident. Because mantra wasn't a prototype that got refined into haki. Mantra was always haki. Oda just decided we didn't need to know that yet. Let's go back to Sky Pier, because Sky Pier is where this starts. The Straw Hats arrive on a sky island, get embroiled in a conflict between the native Shandians and the god-complex lunatic Enel, and encounter a power that none of them can explain. Enel's priests can predict attacks before they happen. They can sense where people are without seeing them. They can react to danger with inhuman precision, and they call this ability mantra. Chapter 257 is where we get our first real explanation of how it works. Mantra is described as the ability to sense the presence and emotions of others, to hear the voice of living things, to predict actions before they occur. One of the priests explains that with sufficient mastery, you can essentially read minds in combat, knowing what your opponent will do before they do it. Now, if you're reading this in 2003, you probably file this under weird Sky Island thing. Skypiea is already full of bizarre, unique elements. Dials that store and release energy. Clouds you can stand on. A civilization that's been isolated from the blue seas for centuries. Mantra seems like another Skypiea-specific power. Something that exists on this island because of some quirk of the setting. Maybe it's related to the dials. Maybe it's a technique the Sky people developed in isolation. It doesn't seem like something that would be relevant once the Straw Hats leave and return to the normal Grand Line. And Oda does nothing to contradict this assumption. He doesn't hint that mantra is part of a larger system. He doesn't have anyone recognize it from elsewhere. He lets readers believe this is a localized phenomenon and moves on. Then we get to Sabaody Archipelago, and things start getting weird. Rayleigh, the Dark King, first mate of the Roger Pirates, demonstrates abilities that seem suspiciously familiar. He can sense people's presence. He can predict attacks. He can do the thing the Skypiea priests could do. And he's never been to Skypiea. He's from the Blue Seas. He's been operating in the normal world his entire life. So how does he have mantra? Readers started asking questions. Theories started forming. And Oda still didn't explain. He just showed us that this ability existed outside of Skypiea and let us sit with that information. The full explanation doesn't come until chapter 597, during the 2-year time-skip training montage. Rayleigh sits Luffy down and explains haki. He breaks it into 3 categories. Observation haki, which lets you sense presence and predict attacks. Armament haki, which lets you hit Logia users and enhance your physical abilities. Conqueror's haki, which lets you overwhelm weak-willed opponents with pure spiritual pressure. And there it is. Mantra is observation haki. The thing the Skypiea priests had been using 300 chapters ago was part of a global power system that every strong fighter in the world can potentially develop. The weird Sky Island ability was never weird or exclusive to Sky Islands. It was one of the fundamental forces of the One Piece universe, and Oda had been showing it to us for years without explaining what we were looking at. The SBS for Volume 65 confirms this explicitly. A reader asks whether mantra and observation haki are the same thing, and Oda says yes. Same ability, different name. The people of Skypiea call it mantra because that's their cultural term for it, but it's the same phenomenon that Rayleigh teaches Luffy during the time skip. This isn't retrofitting. Oda didn't decide later to connect mantra to haki. He designed mantra as haki from the beginning, just under a localized name, because that's what made sense for the characters using it. The priests don't know they're using observation haki because they've never met anyone who calls it that. They have their own tradition, their own terminology, their own understanding of the ability, and Oda trusted readers to eventually figure out the connection. This is a fundamentally different approach to power systems than most shonen manga use. The typical pattern is to introduce a power system with a full explanation up front. Characters discover they have abilities, a mentor figure explains the rules, readers understand the playing field, and then the story explores variations and applications within those established rules. Naruto does this with chakra. Bleach does this with Reiatsu. My Hero Academia does this with quirks. You get the rulebook early so you can follow the game. Oda's approach is the opposite. He shows you the abilities first, without the rulebook, and lets you figure out the patterns over time. You see Mantra in Skypiea. You see Shanks knock out Whitebeard's crew members by walking past them in chapter 434. You see Rayleigh doing impossible things at Sabaody, and slowly, piece by piece, you start to realize that all of these things are connected. The explanation doesn't come until you've already seen dozens of examples. This is incredibly risky from a storytelling perspective. If the examples don't feel consistent, if the abilities seem to work differently in different situations, readers will call you out on it. The power system will feel arbitrary and poorly planned. But Oda pulls it off because, and this is the key point, he knew the rules before he started showing us examples. Mantra works exactly like observation haki because it is observation haki. The abilities are consistent across 300 chapters because they were always the same ability. Oda could show before telling because he had already figured out what he was going to tell. The foreshadowing here isn't a specific plot point or character reveal. It's an entire metaphysical framework, introduced piecemeal across a decade of serialization, clicking into place only when Oda decided we were ready to understand it. And here's what makes this even more impressive. Oda wasn't just hiding the name, he was hiding the scope. When Mantra gets introduced, it seems like a perception ability. When Haki gets explained, we learn it's one of 3 abilities, and that these 3 abilities are the foundation of high-level combat in the entire One Piece world. Every major fighter post-time skip uses Haki. Every Yonko, every Admiral, every serious threat. The thing we thought was a minor Skypiea mechanic turned out to be one of the pillars holding up the entire story's action system. Oda had been building toward this from the moment we met Enel's priests, probably earlier, and he let us think it was just another weird island gimmick. That's not foreshadowing, that's structural engineering. He built the foundation, decorated it to look like set dressing, and only revealed it was load-bearing when the building was tall enough for us to appreciate how much weight it was holding. I need to preface this section by saying that when chapter 1044 dropped, I had to put my phone down and walk around my apartment for about 20 minutes. I'm not exaggerating. I physically could not process what I had just read. Because it wasn't just that Oda revealed Luffy's true power. It wasn't just that the Gomu Gomu no Mi was actually the Hito Hito no Mi model Nika. It wasn't just that everything we thought we knew about our protagonist's abilities was actually a lie told by the world government for 800 years. All of that was insane enough on its own. But then people started pulling up old chapters. People started comparing panels. People started doing the thing that One Piece fans do, where they go back through the archive looking for connections, and what they found broke me. What they found broke a lot of people. Because Oda drew Gear 5 in 2003. He drew it in Skypiea. He drew it 17 years before the reveal. Put it on the page, and nobody knew what they were looking at. Let's start with chapter 253. Because chapter 253 is where the first piece of evidence lives. The Straw Hats are in Skypiea. They're sitting around a campfire with the wolves in Upper Yard. There's a conversation happening, and in the background, there's a silhouette. A figure dancing. It's loose and rubbery looking. It has a strange, elongated posture. It looks, and I cannot stress this enough, exactly like Luffy in Gear 5. Not kind of similar, not vaguely reminiscent. The proportions, the pose, the fluid distortion of the body, it matches. When people overlaid the silhouette onto panels from chapter 1044, the alignment was disturbing. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't Oda reusing a random sketch. This was a deliberate visual plant hidden in the background of a panel that nobody was paying attention to, waiting nearly 2 decades to be understood. But Chapter 253 isn't even the most blatant example. Let's talk about Chapter 287, because Chapter 287 is where Oda stops being subtle. This chapter features a flashback to 400 years ago, showing the Shandian warrior Kalgara and the explorer Noland. During a celebration, the Shandians dance around a fire, and among them, or above them, there's a giant silhouette, a figure with a distinctive outline. It's dancing too. It's joyful. It looks like it's made of rubber. It looks specifically and unmistakably like it's doing exactly what Luffy does when he enters Gear 5. The same fluid, cartoonish movement, the same impossible proportions, the same energy of unrestrained freedom. And the Shandians are dancing with it. They're celebrating with it. They know this figure. They worship this figure. This figure is their god, the sun god. That's what the Shandians worship. That's what their ancestors worshipped. Their entire culture revolves around the sun and the concept of liberation. They fight for freedom. They resist oppression. They've been at war for 400 years because they refuse to submit. And at the center of their mythology is a figure that looks exactly like what Luffy becomes when he fully awakens his devil fruit. Oda put this on the page in 2003. He drew their god and made it look like Luffy's final form. And then he waited 17 years to explain the connection. 17 years! I don't have the emotional capacity to fully express how insane this is. My mind-brain cannot compute. Now you might say, okay, but silhouettes are vague. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe Oda drew a generic dancing figure and later decided to make Gear 5 look similar. And this is a fair skepticism. Silhouettes are inherently ambiguous. They're easy to read meaning into retroactively. If this were the only evidence, I'd be more cautious about the claim. But it's not the only evidence. Because Oda didn't just draw the silhouette. He named the god. He established the mythology. He built an entire theological framework that points directly at what Luffy would become. Chapter 10:18. Who's Who, a former member of CP9, who's been rotting in prison, fights Jinbei and starts talking about something weird. He tells Jinbei about a legend he heard from a guard while imprisoned. The legend of the sun god Nika, a god who would bring smiles to people's faces, a god who would liberate slaves, a god worshipped by those in bondage as a symbol of hope. Who's Who is obsessed with this story because he was imprisoned for failing to protect a devil fruit. A very specific devil fruit, the Gomu Gomu no Mi, the same fruit that Shanks stole and that Luffy eventually ate. Who's Who is connecting dots. He's realizing something. And Oda is telling us to pay attention. The sun god Nika, the warrior of liberation, the figure who brings laughter to the suffering. And 26 chapters later, Luffy awakens his devil fruit. And the transformation doesn't look like other awakenings. It's not just stronger, it's different in kind. Luffy starts moving like a cartoon. He starts changing the properties of objects around him. He starts laughing uncontrollably, joyfully, like he can't help himself. His heartbeat changes to a rhythm that Zunisha, the 1,000-year-old elephant carrying Zu on its back, recognizes. The drums of liberation, the heartbeat of Joy Boy, the sound that hasn't been heard in 800 years. Zunisha has been waiting for this sound since the Void Century, and it's coming from Luffy, the Hito Hito no Mi, model Nika, the human fruit that turns you into the sun god, not rubber. Rubber was always just what it looked like. The real power is freedom. The freedom to fight however you want. The freedom to move however you want. The freedom to be whatever you want. Luffy's power is, quite literally, the ability to make imagination into reality. To fight like a cartoon because he thinks it would be funny. To laugh in the face of death because that's what the sun god does. To embody the spirit of liberation that the world government has been trying to erase for 8 centuries. And Oda set this up in Scipioea. He put the sun god on the page before anyone knew what a sun god was. He drew the awakening 17 years before it happened. He built an entire island arc around a civilization that worships exactly what Luffy would become, and he did it so early in the story that nobody thought to connect it to Luffy's powers. Because why would they? Luffy was a rubber boy. Luffy stretched. That's what the Gomu Gomu no Mi did, except it never did. The stretching was always a side effect of having a body with the properties of the sun god. We were lied to, by the world government, sure, but also in a metatextual sense, by Oda himself. He let us believe we understood Luffy's powers for over 1,000 chapters, and then revealed that we'd only ever understood the surface. This is foreshadowing on a level that I don't think any other work of fiction has achieved. Not because the setup to payoff gap is 17 years, although that alone is staggering, but because Oda didn't just hide a detail. He hid the nature of his protagonist. He let us follow Luffy for over 2 decades without knowing what Luffy actually was. Every fight, every power-up, every gear, we were watching through a lens that was intentionally distorted. The truth was on the page in Skypiea. It was dancing by the fire. It was waiting for us to understand, and we didn't. We couldn't, because we didn't have the context yet. But Oda did. Oda always did. He drew the answer before we even knew there was a question. I want to close out our examination of undeniable foreshadowing with an example that I think perfectly encapsulates Oda's approach to long-term planning. Not because it's the most dramatic reveal, not because it spans the longest time period, but because it demonstrates something crucial about how fictional pirate creator man thinks about his story. Every detail is load-bearing. Every joke is potentially set up. Every throwaway line exists in service of something larger. And nowhere is this more evident than in the case of Kinemon, the samurai who really hates dragons, introduced in an arc that seemed completely disconnected from his homeland, who turned out to be the linchpin of the entire New World Saga's climax. Chapter 656, Punk Hazard. The Straw Hats arrive on a mysterious island that's half fire and half ice, covered in toxic gas, and populated by exactly nobody they were expecting to find. And in the middle of this chaos, they encounter something bizarre, even by One Piece standards, a pair of legs, just legs, walking around by themselves, no torso, no head, just legs with a sword attached. This is our introduction to Kinemon, although we don't know his name yet. We don't know anything about him. We just know that somewhere on this island there's a torso and a head that belong to these legs. And the Straw Hats, being the Straw Hats, decide to help reunite this dismembered samurai with his missing parts. When they finally reassemble Kinemon and he becomes a functional human being again, he's furious. He's been through something terrible. He's looking for his son, Momonosuke. He's from a place called Wano country, which at this point in the story is just a name. We know almost nothing about Wano, except that it's isolated, it produces samurai, and the world government apparently leaves it alone. Kinemon is our first real window into this mysterious country, and Oda uses him to plant seeds that won't fully germinate for nearly a decade. Here's where the dragon thing comes in. During Punk Hazard, there's a dragon. A literal, fire-breathing, European-style dragon that someone apparently created using mad science. The Straw Hats encounter it, fight it, and Kinemon goes absolutely berserk. He doesn't just fight the dragon, he hates the dragon. He makes comments about despising dragons, about having reasons to want every dragon dead, about dragons being connected to his suffering. And at the time, this reads as characterization, maybe even comedy. Here's this over-the-top samurai with an intense personal vendetta against a mythological creature type. It's funny because it's excessive. It's memorable because Kinemon's rage seems disproportionate to the situation. We file it away as a quirk, a personality trait, a bit of flavour for this new character from this mysterious country. But Oda doesn't do flavour. Oda doesn't do quirks for the sake of quirks. Everything means something. And what Kinemon's dragon hatred means is that his homeland, his entire country, has been occupied and brutalized by Kaido, one of the four emperors, whose epithet is King of the Beasts, and whose devil fruit power is the Uo Uo no Mi, model Seiryu, the Azure Dragon. Kaido can transform into a massive eastern dragon. Kaido has been ruling Wano with an iron fist for 20 years. Kaido killed Kinemon's lord, Kozuki Oden, in front of the entire country. Kinemon's hatred of dragons isn't a character quirk. It's trauma. It's the compressed emotional weight of 2 decades of occupation, of watching his country be destroyed, of seeing his friends killed and his culture corrupted. He hates dragons because a dragon took everything from him. And Oda introduced this hatred in Punk Hazard in 2012. The Wano arc didn't properly begin until 2018. The raid on Onigashima, where Kinemon would finally face Kaido directly, didn't happen until 2020. That's 8 years from setup to payoff. 8 years where Kinemon was travelling with or adjacent to the Straw Hats, where his dragon hatred would occasionally resurface, where careful readers might have wondered what the deal was, but most of us just accepted it as part of his personality. And then Wano happened. And suddenly every comment he'd made, every flash of rage at the mention of dragons, every moment of his character across hundreds of chapters clicked into place. This is what I mean when I say nothing is throwaway. Oda introduced Kinemon as comic relief in an arc about mad scientists and poison gas. He gave him a silly power where his devil fruit lets him create disguises by putting things on people's heads. He made him the butt of jokes, the straight man for absurd situations, the samurai who keeps getting into ridiculous predicaments. And underneath all of that, Kinemon was set up. He was the emotional anchor for an arc that wouldn't start for 6 years. His trauma was the foundation for the entire Wano conflict. His dragon hatred was Oda telling us in 2012 that a dragon would be the final boss of the New World's biggest war. The Dressrosa arc adds more layers to this. We learn about the Kozuki family. We learn about Momonosuke's true identity. We learn that Kinemon and his allies travelled forward in time from 20 years ago, that they're essentially ghosts from Wano's past trying to fulfill a mission they started 2 decades prior. Each revelation recontextualizes what we already knew. Kinemon isn't just a samurai who hates dragons. He's a retainer of a murdered lord, a time-displaced warrior, a man carrying the weight of an entire country's hope for liberation. And Oda seeded all of this in Punk Hazard, in an arc that seemed to have nothing to do with samurai or emperors, or the fate of nations. Let me be clear about what this demonstrates. Oda wasn't just planning Wano when he introduced Kinemon. He was planning the emotional journey. He knew that when readers finally got to the Onigashima raid, they would need to be invested in Kinemon's mission. They would need to understand why this fight mattered beyond just defeating a strong enemy, so he gave us years with Kinemon. He let us laugh at his silly power and his stuffy samurai demeanor. He let us travel with him through Dressrosa and Zoo and the build-up to Wano. And then, when the moment came for Kinemon to face the dragon that destroyed his life, we felt it. We felt it because we'd been carrying his dragon hatred with us for 8 years. We felt it because Oda had been preparing us for this confrontation since Punk Hazard. This is the final lesson of Saga 2, the thesis statement for everything we've examined. Laboon and Brooke showed us that Oda plans emotional payoffs across hundreds of chapters. Sanji's lineage showed us that Oda hides identities in plain sight for decades. Mantra and Haki showed us that Oda builds systems before explaining them. Nika and Gear 5 showed us that Oda plants visual foreshadowing in backgrounds, waiting for readers to discover them years later, and Kinemon's dragon hatred shows us that even the jokes, even the character quirks, even the seemingly throwaway details are part of the plan. There is no filler in One Piece. There are only setups we haven't recognized yet. So now we've established the receipts. We've proven, beyond reasonable doubt, that Oda's foreshadowing is genuine, intentional, and operating on timescales that would make other creators weep. But here's the thing. All of those examples are payoffs that have already happened. They're cases where we can look at the setup and the resolution and draw a clean line between them. What about the setups that haven't paid off yet? What about the foreshadowing that's still waiting? Because if Oda is as meticulous as we've demonstrated, if nothing is truly throwaway, then there are bombs still buried in the manga. There are details planted years ago that we don't understand yet. There are revelations coming that will make us go back and reread chapters with new eyes. And in our next saga, we're going to dig into those. We're going to open up the cockery cabinet and start concocting some speculation. We're going to look at the threads that are still dangling, the mysteries that are still unsolved, and try to figure out what fictional pirate creator man is planning next. Because if the past is any indication, whatever's coming is going to make everything we've already seen look like prologue. Everything we've discussed so far has been retrospective. We looked at setups, we looked at payoffs, and we drew clean lines between them. That's satisfying. That's the part of foreshadowing analysis that makes you feel smart, where you can point at evidence and say, definitively, this connected to that. But now we're entering different territory. Now we're going to look at the setups that are still waiting. The bombs Oda has buried that haven't detonated yet. The details that sit in the manga like unexploded ordnance. And we're all just walking around them, waiting for the moment when fictional pirate creator man decides to pull the trigger. And there is no bigger unexploded bomb in One Piece than the national treasure of Mariajois. Let's go back to Dressrosa, because Dressrosa is where this particular thread starts. Chapter 761. Doflamingo, in the middle of his villainous monologue, reveals something that stops the conversation cold. He tells Law that he knows about a treasure hidden in Mariajois. Not just any treasure. A treasure so significant, so dangerous, that knowledge of its existence gives him leverage over the world nobles themselves. The celestial dragons, those untouchable aristocrats who sit at the top of the world's power structure, are afraid of what Doflamingo knows. He can blackmail them. He can make demands. He's a former world noble himself, cast out from paradise, but he retained one crucial piece of information. He knows about the national treasure, and he implies that if this treasure's existence became public knowledge, it would shake the world. Now, at this point, we have no idea what this treasure is. Doflamingo doesn't elaborate. He dangles it as a plot thread, a mystery box that Oda is placing on the mantelpiece for future use. And if you've been paying attention to everything we've discussed in the previous saga, you know what this means. It means Oda already knows what the treasure is. It means there's an answer waiting. It means this isn't a vague gesture toward future plot development, but a specific setup for a specific payoff. The question is what? And the question has been driving the fandom insane for nearly a decade. Then chapter 906 happens, and we get our first glimpse of something deeply wrong at the heart of the world government. The reverie is convening. World leaders are gathering at Mariajois, and in the shadows we see someone we've never seen before. A figure sitting on the empty throne, the seat that supposedly no one is allowed to occupy, the symbol of the world's supposed equality among nations. This figure is holding pictures of specific people. Luffy, Shirahoshi, Blackbeard, Vivi. They're crossing out some faces, considering others. They have a long sword. And then, in one of the most chilling panels Oda has ever drawn, this figure descends into the depths of Mariajois, into a frozen vault that no one should be able to access, and we see it, the national treasure. A giant straw hat. I need you to understand how much this single panel broke people. A straw hat. A massive straw hat, frozen in some kind of preservation chamber, sitting beneath the seat of world power. The same style of hat that Luffy wears. The same style of hat that Shanks wore before him, and Roger before that. A hat that has been passed down through generations, associated with the most dangerous pirates in history, treated as a symbol of dreams and freedom and rebellion against the established order. And there's a giant version of it in Mariajois, hidden as a national treasure, guarded by the world government. What the absolute cost is going on? Let's start concocting some cockery, because
Joy
that's
Boy
what
is
Saga
connected
3 is
to the
for.
sun god Nika
Theory
mythology.
1. Joy Boy
The
is
giant
connected
straw
to the
hat
awakening
belonging
that
to
Luffy
Joy Boy.
achieved in Wano.
This is the most popular
If the
interpretation,
straw hat is a
honestly,
symbol of the sun god,
the one that makes the most
liberation,
thematic sense, of the will that opposes
Joy
the
Boy
world
was a
government,
figure from the void
then it
century
makes sense that
800
Joy
years
Boy
ago
would have
who made a
worn one.
promise he couldn't keep
and it makes
and
sense
left behind
that
an
the world
apology on a
government would have
pony
kept
clip, as a trophy, as evidence, as proof that they defeated Joy Boy 800 years ago and ended the threat he represented. But here's where it gets more complicated. The hat in Marie Joie is giant. It's not human-sized. It's massive, big enough that a normal person would look like a child trying on their parents' clothes. This implies that either Joy Boy was a giant, or the hat has some kind of symbolic or magical significance that we don't understand yet. We know giants exist in One Piece. We know that the ancient kingdom had allies among various races. We know that the Void Century involved conflicts that have been systematically erased from history. Is it possible that Joy Boy was a giant? Is it possible that the sun god mythology spans multiple races, multiple sizes, multiple instantiations of the same will? The hat might not be a direct predecessor to Luffy's hat. It might be a parallel, a different version of the same symbol, worn by a different version of the same archetype. Theory 2. The hat is connected to Im. This is where things get really speculative, but hear me out. Im is clearly not a normal person. They sit on the empty throne. They command the 5 elders. They have information about specific individuals that suggest some kind of future sight or historical awareness, and they have access to the frozen vault where the hat is kept. What if Im isn't just the ruler of the world government? What if Im is the person who defeated Joy Boy? What if Im has been alive since the Void Century, sustained by some means we don't understand, and the hat is their personal trophy from a victory 800 years ago? This would explain why Im is so interested in specific individuals. They're looking for the reincarnation of their enemy. They're looking for the next Joy Boy. And when they find them, they're going to try to do what they did 8 centuries ago. End the threat before it can fully emerge. Theory 3, and this one is out there, but I think it's worth considering. The hat is a devil fruit user. Or was. We know objects can eat devil fruits. We've seen swords with devil fruit powers. We've seen cannons with devil fruit powers. What if the giant straw hat is somehow connected to a devil fruit? What if it's the original vessel for the Nika power, and the world government has been keeping it frozen because they're afraid of what might happen if it's awakened? This would connect the hat directly to Luffy's transformation and suggest that there's a physical lineage of the sun god power that the world government has been trying to suppress. I don't know which theory is correct. Nobody does. That's the point. The National Treasure is a perfect example of Oda's long-term planning, because it's been sitting in the manga since 2016, dangling in front of us, and we still don't have answers. But what we do know, based on everything we've established about how Oda works, is that answers exist. Oda knows what the hat means. He knows why it's giant. He knows how it connects to Joy Boy, to Luffy, to Im, to the Void Century. He's been sitting on this information for nearly a decade, letting us speculate, letting us theory craft, knowing that when the reveal comes, it's going to recontextualize everything we thought we understood about the world's power structure. This is what pending foreshadowing looks like. It's not comfortable. It's not satisfying the way resolved foreshadowing is. It's an itch you can't scratch, a question that haunts you every time you think about the series. But if Oda's track record is any indication, the payoff is coming. And when it does, we're going to look back at chapter 906, at that single panel of a giant frozen hat, and realize that Oda told us everything. We just didn't have the context to understand it yet. Here's something that genuinely frustrates me about One Piece discourse. There's an entire subplot, an entire piece of lore, an entire civilization that Oda took the time to draw and publish in the actual manga, and most fans have never read it. I'm talking about Enel's cover story. I'm talking about the fact that after Enel lost to Luffy in Skypiea, Oda didn't just discard him. He sent him to the moon. And then Oda drew what Enel found there. And what Enel found there is, in my humble opinion as a man who has lost significant portions of his life to analysing fictional pirates, one of the most important pieces of world building in the entire series. But because it's a cover story, because it's those little panels at the top of each chapter that most people skip to get to the main content, a shocking number of readers have no idea it exists. Let me explain how cover stories work for anyone who might not be familiar. Each chapter of One Piece has a cover page, and sometimes those cover pages tell sequential stories about characters who aren't currently in the main narrative. These stories unfold over dozens of chapters, one panel at a time, and they often contain information that becomes plot relevant later. The Baroque Works Agents cover story showed us what happened to them after Alabasta. The CP9 cover story showed us their recovery and hinted at their return. These aren't throwaway content. These are canonical stories that Oda considers important enough to draw, even though they take time away from the main plot. And Enel's cover story, which runs from chapter 428 to chapter 474, might be the most consequential of all of them. So what happens in this cover story? Enel, having lost his battle with Luffy, fulfills his dream of reaching the moon. He actually gets there. His Arc Maxim, that flying ship powered by his lightning abilities, takes him to Fairy Verth, the endless land he always believed existed in the sky. And when he arrives, he doesn't find an empty rock. He finds ruins, ancient ruins. A civilization that existed on the moon long before anyone was keeping records. And living among those ruins, he finds automata, robots, little mechanical beings that have been dormant for who knows how long, waiting for someone to power them up. Enel, being a living battery, does exactly that. He electrifies the automata, they wake up, and they start treating him as a leader. But more importantly, he explores the ruins. And in those ruins, there are murals. There are paintings on the walls that tell a story. The murals depict a civilization that lived on the moon. They had advanced technology. They built the automata. And then, for some reason, they left. They descended to the world below, to the blue planet, to the planet where One Piece takes place. And here's where it gets really interesting. The murals show 3 distinct groups of winged people leaving the moon. 3 groups that correspond exactly to the 3 winged races we know from Skypiea. The Skypians, the Shandians, the Burkans. These 3 groups, who have been living in the sky and on the blue sea for as long as anyone can remember, originally came from the moon. They're not native to the One Piece world. They're immigrants, refugees, people who left their dying homeland and descended to a new world to survive. This is enormous. This is potentially one of the most important pieces of lore in the entire series, and it's hidden in a cover story that most people don't read. Because think about what this implies. The winged races have been part of major storylines. Skypiea was a whole arc. Uruj is a supernova. King, Kaido's right-hand man, is a Lunarian, a race that apparently lived on the Red Line before the world government rose to power. And all of these people, all of these races, have a shared origin. They came from the moon. They had advanced technology. They built robots. And then they came to the Blue Planet, where something happened during the Void Century that erased most of this history. Let's connect some dots here, because this is what Saga 3 is for. Dr. Vegapunk, the world's greatest scientist, has been researching Lunarians. He's been studying King. He's been trying to understand the ancient technology that somehow predates everything the current world knows how to build. And where does ancient technology in One Piece come from? The ancient kingdom. The civilization that existed during the Void Century, that opposed the 20 kingdoms, that would become the world government, that was destroyed and erased from history. What if the ancient kingdom's technology came from the moon? What if the descendants of the lunar civilization allied with the people of the Blue Planet to create something that threatened the ancestors of the celestial dragons? What if the Void Century wasn't just a war between nations, but a war between those who carried the legacy of the moon and those who wanted to erase it? The Lunarians are particularly interesting in this context. King is described as being from a race that could survive in any environment, that lived on top of the Red Line before the celestial dragons moved there. Before. The Lunarians were displaced. They were removed from the Red Line to make room for Mariageois. And now, they're nearly extinct, with King being possibly the last of his kind. The world government didn't just defeat the ancient kingdom, they systematically eliminated or displaced the races that were connected to it, the Lunarians. Potentially the giants of Elbaf, who we know have ancient connections to the world's history. Potentially the fishmen and merfolk who Joy Boy made promises to. The Void Century wasn't just a cover-up of events, it was a purge of peoples. And all of this is seeded in a cover story. All of this is sitting there in chapters that most readers flip past to get to the real content. Oda drew an entire ancient civilization on the moon, showed us its connection to known races in the story, implied a massive historical migration that predates everything we thought we knew about the One Piece world, and he did it in bonus content. Because Oda doesn't waste panels, ever. Not in the main story, and not in the cover stories. If he's drawing something, it matters. If he's showing us Enel discovering moon ruins, those ruins are going to be relevant. Here's my speculation, and this is pure cockery, so take it with the appropriate amount of skepticism. I think the moon is going to be relevant to the endgame. I think the technology that Vegapunk has been developing, the secrets of the Void Century that he's uncovered, the unforgivable research that the world government wants to suppress, all of it connects back to the lunar civilization. Automata that Enel found are the same type of technology that powers the Pacifista, that powers the Seraphim, that powers whatever ancient weapons are still waiting to be revealed. Vegapunk didn't invent this stuff, he rediscovered it. He reverse-engineered technology that existed before the Void Century, technology that came from the moon, technology that the world government has been trying to keep buried because it proves that the official history is a lie. The winged racers know something. Or they knew something, before centuries of separation and cultural drift made them forget their origins. The Shandians were fighting to protect a poneglyph. The Skypieans had their own understanding of history that didn't match the Blue Seas. The Birkans, Enel's people, had legends about fairy Verth that turned out to be literally true. These scattered communities, spread across the Sky Islands and the Blue Seas, are fragments of a civilization that predates the world government. And Oda told us this in a cover story. He told us nearly 20 years ago, and we're still waiting for the main narrative to catch up. This is what I mean when I say Oda doesn't waste panels. A cover story about a villain going to the moon sounds like a joke. It sounds like Oda having fun, sending a defeated enemy on a silly adventure because he liked the character too much to just drop him. But it's not a joke, it's setup. It's world building that will become essential when the truth about the Void Century is finally revealed. And every time I think about the fact that this information has been available since 2006, just sitting there, waiting for readers to pay attention to it, I want to scream. Because Oda is playing a game that spans decades, and half of us aren't even looking at all the pieces. Let me set the stage for why Vegapunk is one of the most important characters in One Piece, despite being introduced properly only recently. For years, decades really, Vegapunk was a name, a legend, the greatest scientific mind in the world, working for the world government, responsible for basically every technological advancement in the series. The Pacifista, Vegapunk, the Sea Prism Stone innovations, Vegapunk, the artificial devil fruits, Vegapunk. The Seraphim, those terrifying child-shaped weapons that combine Lunarian DNA with cloned warlord bodies? Vegapunk. This man has been the invisible hand behind the world government's military supremacy for decades, and for most of the series, we never saw his face. He was a shadowy genius, a name dropped to explain how impossible things became possible. A convenient answer to the question, how does this technology exist in a world of pirates and swords? And then Egghead happened. And we met Vegapunk. Or rather, we met Vegapunks, plural, because the man is so obsessed with efficiency that he split his personality into 6 satellite bodies just to get more work done. And almost immediately upon meeting him, Oda drops a bomb that recontextualizes everything we thought we knew about this character. Vegapunk knows about the Void Century. Not suspects, not theorizes, knows. He has studied the poneglyphs. He has researched the ancient kingdom. He has uncovered truths that the world government has been trying to bury for 800 years. And the moment this becomes clear, the moment it's obvious that Vegapunk has information that could unravel the entire global order, the world government decides he needs to die. Chapter 1066 is where this really crystallizes. Vegapunk explains to the Straw Hats that the world they live in is a lie. The official history is a fabrication. The Void Century was deliberately erased to hide something so significant that the ancestors of the current world government considered it worth committing historical genocide to conceal. And Vegapunk, through his research, has pieced together at least part of the truth. He knows about the ancient kingdom. He knows about the advanced civilization that existed before the world government rose to power. He knows that the technology he's been developing isn't innovation, it's archaeology. He's been rediscovering things that already existed, things that were destroyed and suppressed, things that prove the current rulers of the world built their power on lies and atrocities. This connects directly to what we discussed in the previous section about the moon civilization. Vegapunk's technology doesn't come from nowhere. The pacifista design, the energy systems, the artificial life, all of it has precedence in the ancient past. The automata on the moon, the Lunarian physiology that Vegapunk has been studying through King, the ancient robots that exist on Egghead itself, machines that predate the Void Century and still function after 800 years. Vegapunk isn't a genius who invented new things. He's a genius who understood old things. He looked at the fragments of a destroyed civilization and figured out how they worked. And in doing so, he uncovered truths that the world government cannot allow to spread. But here's where it gets really interesting. Vegapunk doesn't just know historical facts. He's done something with that knowledge. Something the world government considers unforgivable. That word specifically gets used. Unforgivable. Not illegal, not treasonous, unforgivable. As if Vegapunk hasn't just broken rules but violated something sacred, something that the people in power cannot tolerate regardless of his usefulness to them. And remember, Vegapunk has been useful, absurdly useful. He's the reason the Marines have any technological edge at all. The Seraphim alone are potentially worth more than entire fleets. Killing Vegapunk means losing access to his genius forever. And they're doing it anyway. Whatever he's done, whatever he knows, it's so dangerous that the world government would rather lose their greatest asset than risk him sharing it. So what's the unforgivable research? This is where we start concocting cockery because Oda hasn't fully revealed it yet. But we have clues. We have Kuma's memories. We have the broadcast that Vegapunk prepared before his apparent death. We have the fragments of information scattered through the Egghead arc that point towards something massive. Kuma's memories are particularly significant. Bartholomew Kuma, the former warlord who became a mindless weapon for the world government, had his entire personality extracted and stored. Vegapunk kept those memories. He preserved the consciousness of a man the world government wanted erased. And Kuma's history connects to some of the most sensitive topics in the One Piece world. He was king of the Sorbet Kingdom. He was a revolutionary working with Dragon. He was a member of a special race, the Buccaneers, who apparently have some connection to the ancient past that we don't fully understand yet. And he agreed to become a weapon, to sacrifice his humanity, for reasons that are only now becoming clear. Kuma knew something. Vegapunk learned what Kuma knew. And that knowledge is part of what's now threatening to come out. The broadcast is the big one. Before the Egghead incident fully resolved, Vegapunk set up a transmission. A message to the entire world. Using technology that can reach every corner of the globe simultaneously, Vegapunk prepared to tell everyone something. And the world government is terrified. They're not just trying to kill Vegapunk. They're trying to stop the message. They're trying to prevent the information from spreading. Because once it's out there, once the whole world hears whatever Vegapunk has to say, the lie can't be maintained anymore. The Void Century stops being ancient history and becomes current events. My speculation is this: Vegapunk's unforgivable research isn't just about knowing the past. It's about proving the past. He hasn't just uncovered information about the ancient kingdom. He's found evidence. Physical, undeniable evidence that the world government's foundation is built on a crime so massive that revealing it would delegitimize their entire authority. Maybe it's proof that the celestial dragon's ancestors weren't noble founders, but violent usurpers. Maybe it's evidence that the ancient kingdom had a peaceful solution to the world's problems and the 20 kingdoms destroyed it out of greed or fear. Maybe it's something about Im specifically, about who or what Im actually is, about how long they've been alive and what they did 800 years ago. Whatever it is, it's connected to everything. The giant straw hat in Maria Joie, the moon civilization, the Lunarians and their displacement, the Will of D and what it represents. Vegapunk has been researching all of this, piecing together the puzzle that Oda has been laying out for 27 years. And the broadcast is going to be the moment where Oda, through Vegapunk, starts actually answering questions. Not all of them, probably not even most of them, but enough
to shift the story into its final phase. Enough to make the Void Century stop being a mystery and start being a motivation. Enough to give Luffy and everyone else a clear understanding of what they're actually fighting against. This is pending foreshadowing at its most intense. We're watching the setup happen in real time. We're watching Oda position pieces for a revelation that he's been building towards since Chapter 218, when Robin first explained what the Void Century was. Every arc since then has added fragments. Every revelation has raised more questions. And Vegapunk, this character we waited over 1,000 chapters to properly meet, is the vehicle Oda has chosen to start delivering answers. The unforgivable research is unforgivable because it threatens to end the era. Not just the era of piracy, the era of lies. The era where the truth about the world can be suppressed because no one has the evidence to challenge the official story. Vegapunk has the evidence. And whether he lives or dies, that evidence is about to change everything. I need to start this section with a confession. I don't know what to think about Shanks. I've been reading One Piece for a very long time, and for most of that time, I thought I understood who Shanks was. He was the cool mentor figure, the guy who inspired Luffy, the emperor who represented the romanticized ideal of piracy, freedom and adventure without the cruelty of someone like Kaido or Big Mom. Shanks was a good guy. Shanks was on Luffy's side. Shanks was going to show up at the end and be proud of how far Luffy had come. That was the narrative. That was what I believed. And then Oda started pulling threads, and I realized that nothing about Shanks has ever made sense. And I've just been ignoring the contradictions because I wanted him to be simple. Let's start at the very beginning. Chapter 1. Shanks is in a bar in Fuchsia Village, hanging out with his crew, getting harassed by mountain bandits. Luffy, a child, eats a devil fruit that Shanks was keeping in a chest. The bandits escalate, Luffy gets thrown in the ocean, a Sea King appears, and Shanks saves Luffy but loses his arm in the process. This is the foundational scene of One Piece. This is the moment that defines Luffy's dream, his relationship with the Straw Hat, his entire motivation as a character. And it makes no sense. Shanks is an emperor. Shanks was already one of the most powerful pirates in the world at this point. He had sailed on the Roger Pirate's ship. He had been to Laugh Tale. He had Conqueror's haki, strong enough to damage physical objects just by walking onto a ship. This man, this absolute monster of a human being, lost his arm to a Sea King. A Sea King. The things that Luffy one-shots in the first chapter of the story after the time skip. The things that are basically wildlife hazards, dangerous to normal people but trivial obstacles for anyone with real power. Shanks could have used Haki to knock it out. Shanks could have moved fast enough to save Luffy without getting bitten. Shanks could have done literally anything other than sacrifice a limb to a creature that should have been no threat to him whatsoever. So why did he lose the arm? The in-story explanation is that he bet it on the new era, that he willingly sacrificed it for Luffy's sake as a symbolic gesture of faith in the next generation. And that's beautiful. That's a great thematic moment. But it doesn't explain the logistics. Shanks didn't need to lose the arm to save Luffy. He chose to lose it. Or something else happened that we don't understand yet. Because the alternative is that Oda made a mistake in Chapter 1, that he didn't realize how strong Shanks would need to be and accidentally created a plot hole, and I don't believe that. Not after everything we've established about how Oda plans. The arm sacrifice is set up for something. We just don't know what. Then there's Film Red. And I know the movies aren't necessarily canon, but Oda was heavily involved in this one, and it revealed information about Shanks that feels too significant to ignore. We learn that Shanks was found as a baby in a treasure chest by the Roger pirates. He was discovered during the God Valley incident, the same event where Rocksteady Xebec was defeated, where Garp and Roger allegedly teamed up, where the current power structure of the pirate world was established. Shanks was a baby at God Valley, and God Valley was connected to the Celestial Dragons. The dots start connecting in uncomfortable ways. Chapter 907 is where I started losing sleep over Shanks. The reverie is happening. World leaders are gathering. Security is at maximum. And Shanks just walks in. He walks into Marie Joie. He requests an audience with the 5 elders. And they agree. They meet with him. The 5 elders, the highest authority in the world government beneath him, take time out of their schedule to sit down with a pirate emperor. And they discuss a certain pirate. We don't know which pirate. We don't know what Shanks told them. We don't know what was agreed upon. But the fact that this meeting happened at all is insane. No other pirate could do this. No other emperor would even try. Shanks has access. Shanks has a relationship with the people who run the world. And we have no idea why. The Figureland reveal makes it worse. One of the 5 elders, the one with the massive sword who looks like Gandhi if Gandhi could destroy islands, is Saint Figureland Garling. Figureland. The same family name that's been connected to Shanks through Film Red and other supplementary materials. Shanks is a Figureland. Shanks is related to, or at least connected to, one of the 5 elders. Shanks has celestial dragon blood. The man who inspired Luffy, who gave him the straw hat, who represents freedom and dreams and everything the world government opposes, is potentially part of the ruling class. What the sake of a takeout is going on? I'm going to lay out the possibilities as I see them, and none of them are comfortable. Option 1. Shanks is genuinely a good guy who happens to have noble blood, and he's using his connections to work against the world government from within. He met with the elders to manipulate them, to buy time for Luffy, to play some kind of long game that we don't understand yet. This is the hopeful reading. This is what I want to believe. But it requires a lot of faith in Shanks' intentions that the text hasn't actually earned. Option 2. Shanks is compromised. Maybe not evil, but working for interests that aren't aligned with Luffy's. Maybe he believes in some version of order that requires the world government to exist. Maybe he's trying to manage the transition of eras, rather than overthrow the system entirely. Maybe his meeting with the elders was about containing threats like Blackbeard while preserving the status quo. This reading makes his arm sacrifice even more complicated, because it means he invested in Luffy while potentially planning to limit what Luffy can achieve. Option 3. Shanks is playing a game so complex that we can't even see the board yet. He's neither simply good nor simply compromised. He's operating on information we don't have, toward goals we can't understand, using methods that seem contradictory because we're missing crucial context. The arm sacrifice meant something specific that we won't understand until Oda reveals what Shanks actually knows about Joy Boy, about Luffy's devil fruit, about the Void Century, about whatever secrets he inherited from his time on Roger's ship. What I know for certain is this: Shanks has been suspicious since Chapter 1, and Oda has been adding layers of suspicion for 27 years. The arm, the elders, the Figureland connection. The fact that he stopped Kaido from going to Marineford, and we still don't know how or why. The fact that he showed up at Wano, showed off the most powerful haki we've ever seen, killed a major antagonist in literally one panel, and then left without explaining anything. Every Shanks appearance raises more questions than it answers. Every piece of new information makes the old information stranger. He's the most important character we know almost nothing about, and when Oda finally reveals what his deal is, it's going to recontextualize the entire story from page 1. I don't know if I'm ready for it, but it's coming. It's been coming since 1997. Monkey D. Luffy, Gold D. Roger, Portgas D. Ace, Portgas D. Rouge, Marshall D. Teach, Trafalgar D. Waterlaw, Monkey D. Dragon, Monkey D. Garp, Jaguar D. Saul, Rox D. Zebek, Nefertari D. Lily. That's not a complete list. That's just the D carriers we know about, the ones Oda has confirmed over the course of the series, and every single one of them shares something beyond the letter in their name. They share a pattern of behavior. They share a relationship with fate. They share a smile. The smile is the thing that haunts me. D carriers smile when they die. Not all of them have died, obviously, but the ones who have, or the ones who came close, they smile. Roger smiled on the execution platform. He smiled so wide that it launched the Great Pirate Era. Ace smiled when Akainu's fist went through his chest. He smiled at Luffy, at peace with his death, grateful for being loved. Saul smiled as Aokiji froze him, laughing his ridiculous dereshishishi laugh while telling Robin to live. Rouge smiled after giving birth to Ace, after holding on through pregnancy for 20 months to protect her son, finally letting go with joy on her face. This is not normal. This is not how people face death. This is something specific to the D, something in their blood or their will, or their very nature that makes them meet the end with a grin. Oda has been consistent about this for over 1,000 chapters. Every time a D carrier faces death, they smile. It's not a coincidence. It's not a character quirk that happens to repeat. It's a rule. It's a law of the One Piece universe as fundamental as devil fruits or haki. The D smile at death. And that consistency tells us something important. Whatever the D is, Oda knew from the beginning. He knew what it meant. He knew how D carriers would behave. He's been writing to that specification since Roger's execution in Chapter 1. The will of D isn't something he's making up as he goes. It's load-bearing structure that he established before serialization began. So what is it? What does the D actually mean? We have hints. We have fragments. We have pieces of a puzzle that's been scattered across decades of manga. Let's assemble what we know. First, the D is connected to the Void Century. This much is essentially confirmed. The world government fears the D. They call it God's natural enemy. Rocinante, Doflamingo's brother, told Law that D carriers have been the enemies of the celestial dragons throughout history. The gods in question aren't metaphorical. They're the world nobles, the descendants of the 20 kings who founded the world government. The D opposes them. The D has always opposed them. And whatever happened during the Void Century, the D were on the side that lost, or the side that was supposed to lose, but didn't entirely. Second, the D might be inherited will, rather than bloodline. This is speculative, but consider the evidence. The D carriers we know come from vastly different backgrounds, different nations, different races, different walks of life. Luffy is from East Blue, Roger was from somewhere else entirely. Law is from the North Blue. Xebec apparently had the D, despite being a ruthless pirate who wanted to conquer the world. The D isn't a single family. It's not like the Kozuki or the Nefertari. It's something that appears across the world, across generations, connecting people who have no other relationship to each other. Maybe the D is a symbol of something, a marker of inherited will, a sign that someone carries the dream of the ancient kingdom forward, whether they know it or not. Third, the D is connected to Joy Boy and Nika. This is the newest piece of the puzzle, and it's the one that makes everything click into place. Joy Boy was a figure from the Void Century who made promises he couldn't keep. Nika is the sun god, the warrior of liberation, the figure whose power Luffy now embodies. And the D carriers are called God's natural enemy. If the celestial dragons are the gods in question, and if Joy Boy and Nika opposed them 800 years ago, then the D might be the lineage of that opposition. Not a bloodline in the genetic sense, but a spiritual succession. The people who carry the D carry the will of Joy Boy, the will to be free, the will to liberate others, the will to smile at death because death isn't an ending, it's a passing of the torch. Now let's talk about some specific D carriers who complicate the picture. Jaguar D Saul is the one that recently broke the fandom's collective brain. For years, we thought Saul was dead. Aokiji froze him on Ohara. It was a tragic death scene. Robin mourned him. The story moved on. And then, nearly 1,000 chapters later, Oda revealed that Saul survived. He's alive. He's been on Elbaf this whole time, protecting the books and knowledge that were rescued from Ohara before its destruction. A D carrier we thought was dead wasn't dead. He was in hiding, preserving forbidden history, waiting for the right moment to return to relevance. This tells us that Oda has been planning Saul's return since at least when he killed him. It tells us that D carriers don't die easily, or don't stay dead, or have some relationship with death that we don't fully understand. The smile might not be acceptance of the end. It might be knowledge that the end isn't really the end. Trafalgar D Waterlaw adds another wrinkle. Law's devil fruit, the Ope Ope no Mi, has a legendary ultimate technique, the perennial youth operation, a surgery that grants immortality to the recipient at the cost of the user's life. This technique exists, it's canon, and we know it's been used before because someone in the past performed it. The obvious speculation is that Im is the recipient. Im has been alive since the Void Century. Im sits on the empty throne. Im has knowledge of specific individuals across generations. If someone performed the immortality surgery on Im 800 years ago, that would explain everything. And who performed it? Possibly a D carrier. Possibly someone who smiled as they died, knowing that their sacrifice would serve some larger purpose we can't yet understand. Rock's D Xebec is the wild card. Everything we know about the D suggests they're aligned with freedom and joy, and opposition to tyranny. But Xebec was a tyrant himself. He wanted to conquer the world. He ruled his crew through fear. He was so dangerous that Garp and Roger, mortal enemies, had to team up to defeat him. And he had the D. How does this fit? Maybe the D doesn't guarantee goodness. Maybe it's just power, just will, just the capacity to shake the world. Xebec used that capacity for domination. Roger and Luffy use it for freedom. The D itself might be neutral, a marker of potential rather than destiny. Or maybe Xebec represents a corruption of the D, a perversion of what it was supposed to mean. We don't know. We won't know until Oda tells us. What I believe, and this is pure cockery based on 27 years of pattern recognition, is that the D stands for dawn. The dawn that the Kozuki have been waiting for. The dawn that will come when the truth of the Void Century is revealed. The dawn that Joy Boy promised and couldn't deliver, that Luffy will finally bring about. The will of D is the will of dawn. The carriers of the D are the carriers of the morning. They smile at death because they know the sun is rising. They oppose the gods because the gods want eternal night. And when Luffy finally reaches Laugh Tale, when he learns the truth and laughs like Roger did, he'll understand what the D means. He'll understand why he smiles. He'll understand that he's been carrying the dawn his entire life, even when he didn't know it. This is the biggest pending foreshadowing in One Piece. The D has been there since chapter 1. Oda has been consistent about it for over 1,000 chapters. And when the answer finally comes, it's going to recontextualize everything. Every death, every smile, every time someone said inherited will without fully understanding what they meant. The D is the thread that ties the entire story together, from Roger's execution to Luffy's awakening. And we're so close to finally understanding it. We've been waiting 27 years. The dawn is almost here. We've spent the last 2 sagas examining specific examples. We've looked at foreshadowing that paid off and foreshadowing that's still waiting. We've traced threads across decades and marveled at the connections. But now I want to zoom out and ask a different question. Not what has Oda foreshadowed, but how is this even possible? Because the more you think about it, the more impossible it seems. One Piece has been running for over 27 years. It has over 1,100 chapters. It has hundreds of named characters, dozens of islands, multiple power systems, an intricate political structure, and a timeline that spans at least 800 years of in-universe history. Maintaining coherence across that scope isn't just difficult. It should be impossible. Human memory doesn't work that way. Human attention doesn't work that way. And yet here we are, finding connections between Chapter 102 and Chapter 487, between Chapter 253 and Chapter 1044, between details planted decades ago and payoffs delivered in the present day. How does Oda do it? The answer, as far as we can determine from external evidence, is documentation. Rigorous, obsessive, almost pathological documentation. Oda doesn't just write one piece. He maintains one piece. He has systems for tracking continuity that go far beyond what most authors would consider necessary. And the clearest evidence of this is the Vivre Card Databook series. For those unfamiliar, Vivre Cards are a supplementary publication that Oda produces alongside the main manga. They're collectible cards, essentially, each one dedicated to a specific character, containing detailed information about that character's statistics, history, and trivia. Birthday, blood type, height, favorite food, devil fruit classification, bounty history, homeland, relationships. The Vivre cards contain information that often doesn't appear in the manga itself, details that Oda has apparently been tracking internally and only releases through this supplementary format. And the level of detail is genuinely staggering. Every character has a birthday, not just the main cast. Background characters, villains who appeared for 3 chapters, side characters from arcs that happened 15 years ago. Oda has assigned specific birthdays to hundreds of characters, and these birthdays are consistent. They don't change. They're referenced in SBS columns when fans ask about them. They're used for official celebrations and merchandise. This might seem trivial, but think about what it implies. Oda is tracking the birth dates of characters he created 20 years ago and may never use again. He's maintaining a database of fictional vital statistics comprehensive enough that he can answer fan questions about any character at any time. This isn't normal author behavior. This is the behavior of someone who treats their fictional world as a real place that needs consistent records. Blood types are another example. In Japan, blood type is culturally associated with personality traits, similar to how Western cultures sometimes treat astrological signs. Oda assigns blood types to his characters, and fans have noted that these assignments often reflect personality patterns. The aggressive characters tend to have one blood type. The gentle characters tend to have another. Whether this is meaningful or just Oda having fun, it demonstrates the same principle.
He's tracking details that most authors wouldn't bother with. He's building a world where every character, no matter how minor, exists as a complete person with vital statistics and background information. The height charts are where you really see the obsession. Oda has published official height comparisons showing exactly how tall every character is relative to every other character. These heights are maintained consistently across the manga. When characters stand next to each other, their relative heights match the official statistics. When giant characters appear, their size is scaled appropriately to the established numbers. This seems like a small thing, but visual consistency in manga is notoriously difficult to maintain. Characters drift in size. Proportions change based on what's dramatically appropriate. Most mangaka don't worry too much about precise scaling because readers don't usually notice. But Oda notices. Oda cares. Oda has decided that if Big Mom is 880 centimeters tall, she needs to look 880 centimeters tall in every panel she appears in, relative to whoever else is in the frame. Bounty progression is tracked with similar rigor. Every character who has a bounty history. We know what Luffy's bounty was at each stage of his journey. We know how bounties have changed over time for recurring characters. We know the ranking of bounties across the entire pirate world. This information exists because Oda keeps it, maintains it, updates it as the story progresses. The bounty system isn't just a narrative device. It's a tracked metric within Oda's internal documentation. What all of this suggests is that Oda approaches One Piece less like a story he's telling and more like a world he's simulating. He's not making things up as needed. He's drawing from a comprehensive database of pre-existing information. When a character appears, Oda doesn't decide in the moment what their deal is. He checks his records. He consults his notes. He ensures that what he draws is consistent with what he's already established, even if that establishment happened 15 years ago, and most readers have forgotten. This is the infrastructure that makes foreshadowing possible at scale. When Oda planted the Laboon thread in Chapter 102, he wrote down that this whale was connected to a future crew member. When he created Sanji, he documented the royal lineage that wouldn't be revealed for 15 years. When he designed the Skypiea arc, he recorded that the silhouettes in the background were connected to powers he wouldn't explain until Wano. The foreshadowing isn't memory, it's documentation. The setups don't work because Oda has superhuman recall. They work because Oda has superhuman record keeping. The Vivre cards are just the public-facing portion of this system. The actual notes, the internal documentation, the notebooks and files, and whatever organizational system Oda actually uses, those are presumably far more comprehensive. What we see in the databooks is what Oda considers shareable with the public. The full picture is probably terrifying. Imagine a filing system containing every detail about every character, every location, every event, every planned reveal, every connection between plot threads, all maintained and updated weekly for nearly 3 decades. That's what enables One Piece's continuity. That's what makes the foreshadowing work. And here's the thing that doesn't get acknowledged enough. This is a choice. Oda chose to work this way. He chose to maintain this level of documentation. He chose to treat One Piece as a comprehensive world rather than a sequence of stories. Most authors don't make this choice because it's exhausting. It's time-consuming. It adds massive overhead to an already brutal production schedule, but Oda decided, probably very early, in the process, that he wanted One Piece to be the kind of story where everything connects, and then he built the systems necessary to make that happen. The genius isn't just creative, it's organizational. Oda isn't just a great storyteller, he's a great project manager. He's been running a decades-long creative enterprise with the rigor of a corporation and the passion of an artist. The Vivre card Bible is just the visible evidence of a much larger system, a system that makes the impossible possible, one documented detail at a time. I've spent a lot of this video praising Oda. I've called his foreshadowing unprecedented. I've described his documentation systems as pathological. I've argued that One Piece operates on a level of narrative coherence that no other long-running manga can match. And I stand by all of that.
But I'm not here to be a sycophant. I'm not here to pretend that Oda is an infallible god who has never made a mistake. Because he has. He's made plenty of mistakes. The difference, and this is the crucial point, is that Oda's mistakes are almost universally cosmetic rather than structural. He messes up colours. He occasionally forgets which side a scar is on. He draws haki inconsistently across different arcs. But he doesn't mess up plot. He doesn't contradict his own world building. He doesn't create foreshadowing that leads nowhere or payoffs that don't match their setups. The errors are surface level. The architecture remains sound. Let's start with the Marco effect because this is the most famous category of Oda error. Marco, the first division commander of the Whitebeard Pirates, has a distinctive appearance. He's got that sleepy look, that pompadour hairstyle, and most importantly, he transforms into a blue phoenix. His devil fruit, the Tori Tori no Mi model, Phoenix, produces blue flames. This is established. This is consistent in the manga. Blue Phoenix, blue flames, simple enough. Except somewhere along the line, official coloured materials depicted Marco's Phoenix form as yellow, or green, or some colour that was definitely not blue. And fans lost their minds. The Marco effect has become shorthand for colour inconsistencies in One Piece. It happens more often than you'd expect. Characters whose hair colour changes between appearances, outfits that are one colour in the manga's cover pages and a different colour in the anime, official merchandise that doesn't match official art. Some of this is miscommunication between Oda and the various teams that produce coloured One Piece content. Some of it is Oda himself changing his mind about what colour something should be. And some of it is just mistakes, pure and simple, where nobody caught the inconsistency before publication. But here's the thing. None of this matters for the story. Marco's Phoenix being temporarily depicted as the wrong colour doesn't affect his character arc. It doesn't contradict his abilities. It doesn't create plot holes. It's a visual error that gets corrected in subsequent materials. The Marco effect is annoying for people who care about visual consistency, and I count myself among them. But it's not a structural problem. It's not the kind of error that undermines the narrative. Oda can mess up colours all day long, and the story remains intact. The Zoro scar situation is similar, and it's become such a meme that I almost didn't want to bring it up. Zoro has a scar over his left eye. Post-time skip, that eye is permanently closed. This is a significant character design element that fans have theorized about for years. What happened to the eye? Is it actually damaged, or is Zoro hiding something? Will it open at a crucial moment? These are ongoing discussions, and occasionally in certain panels, the scar appears to be on the wrong side. It's on the right eye instead of the left. Or the closed eye is the wrong one. Or the scar is just missing entirely. Is this Oda forgetting which eye he scarred? Is it an assistant error that slipped through editing? Is it the printing process flipping images somehow? We don't know. What we do know is that it happens rarely. It gets corrected in volume releases when caught, and it doesn't affect the story. Zoro's scar being on the wrong side for one panel doesn't change anything about his character or his journey. It's a continuity error of the most superficial kind. The kind that every long-running manga has, because drawing thousands of pages over decades while maintaining perfect visual consistency is essentially impossible. Heki visualization is a more interesting case because it's inconsistent in ways that feel intentional even when they might not be. Early haki, particularly armament haki, wasn't always visually depicted. Characters would use it without their skin turning black. The hardening effect that became standard post-time skip wasn't present in pre-time skip scenes where haki was clearly being used. This creates awkward questions. Was Shanks using armament haki when he blocked Akainu at Marineford? His arm didn't turn black. But he also didn't take damage from magma, which should be impossible without haki. So was he using it or not? And if he was, why doesn't it look like the haki we see later? The most charitable interpretation is that Oda refined his visual language for haki over time. Early on, he didn't feel the need to make it visible. Later, he decided that showing haki made fights clearer for readers. The inconsistency isn't an error so much as an evolution of artistic choice. But even if you don't buy that interpretation, even if you think Oda just didn't have the visual system figured out early on, it still doesn't break the story. Haki works the way it's supposed to work. The rules are consistent even if the visuals aren't always. Characters who should be able to use haki can use haki. Characters who shouldn't be able to use it can't. The power system functions correctly. It's just not always drawn the same way. The Yamato situation is probably the most contentious example I could bring up, and I'm going to tread carefully here because this touches on issues that go beyond simple continuity errors. Yamato uses masculine pronouns in Japanese. Other characters refer to Yamato with masculine language. Yamato claims to be Kozuki Oden, a man, and treats this as identity rather than roleplay. And yet the Vivre card databooks list Yamato as female. The bathhouse scene in Wano shows Yamato in the women's bath. Official materials are inconsistent about how to categorize this character. Is this an error? Is it intentional ambiguity? Is it Oda saying something about identity that doesn't translate cleanly across cultures? I genuinely don't know. What I do know is that it's created confusion in the fan base, and that the official materials don't provide a clear resolution. This is one case where Oda's documentation system has arguably failed, or at least failed to communicate clearly. But even here, the structural story isn't affected. Yamato's role in Wano, Yamato's relationship with Luffy and the crew, Yamato's character arc, none of that is undermined by the pronoun ambiguity. It's a characterization question rather than a plot question. The pattern across all of these examples is consistent. Oda makes mistakes on the surface. Colors, scar positions, visual representations of powers, character categorizations in supplementary materials. These are real errors, and I'm not going to pretend they don't exist. But when it comes to the load-bearing elements, the plot threads that span decades, the foreshadowing that connects early chapters to late reveals, the consistency of world building and character motivation, Oda doesn't make mistakes. Or if he does, they're so rare that we haven't found them yet. The structure is sound. The architecture holds. The surface might have some cracks in the paint, but the foundation is granite. That's not an excuse for the errors. It's an observation about priorities. Oda has finite time and energy, and he apparently allocates that energy toward getting the big things right, even if it means occasionally getting small things wrong. Given the constraints of weekly serialization, given the impossible scope of this project, I think that's the correct allocation. I'd rather have perfect plot and imperfect colors than the reverse, and that's exactly what One Piece delivers. I want to be clear about something before we dive into this section. I'm not here to trash other manga. I'm not here to tell you that Naruto is bad or Bleach is worthless or that any series that isn't One Piece doesn't deserve your time. That would be childish, and more importantly, it would be wrong. These are all successful works of fiction that have brought joy to millions of people. They all have strengths that One Piece doesn't have. They all do things that Oda doesn't do, or can't do, or chose not to do. The point of this comparison isn't to crown One Piece the winner and dismiss everything else. The point is to establish context, to show that what Oda does with foreshadowing isn't just good writing. It's genuinely anomalous. It's outside the normal parameters of how long-running serialized fiction operates. And the only way to demonstrate that is to look at how other series in the same medium handle the same challenges. Let's start with Naruto, because I already mentioned the Toby example earlier, and I want to expand on it. Naruto ran for 15 years. It has over 700 chapters. It's one of the most successful manga of all time. And Kishimoto, its creator, is clearly a talented storyteller who cared about his work. But Naruto's foreshadowing operates on a fundamentally different model than One Piece's. Kishimoto planted seeds, but he didn't always know what those seeds would grow into. He made decisions reactively based on where the story was going, rather than proactively based on where he'd already decided it would end. The Toby reveal is the clearest example. Toby's identity as Obito Uchiha was presented as a major revelation, and fans who had theorized it felt vindicated. But Kishimoto has admitted in interviews that Toby's identity changed during the planning process. At various points, Toby was going to be other characters. The hints that fans identified as foreshadowing were partially intentional and partially retrofitted once the Obito decision was locked in. This doesn't make the reveal bad. It landed emotionally for many readers. But it's not the same thing as what Oda does. Oda doesn't change his mind about major reveals. When he plants a seed in chapter 100, he knows what tree it's going to become. Kishimoto planted seeds and then decided later what species they were. Naruto also has notable continuity issues that One Piece doesn't. Power scaling became increasingly inconsistent as the series progressed. Characters who were established as strong became irrelevant as new power tiers were introduced. The ninja world's political structure, which seemed important early on, became almost meaningless by the final war arc. These aren't foreshadowing failures exactly, but they're structural inconsistencies that suggest Kishimoto wasn't working from a comprehensive long-term plan. He was writing a great story, but he was writing it more reactively than Oda writes One Piece. Bleach is a more extreme example of the reactive approach. Tite Kubo is an incredible artist and character designer. Bleach has some of the most iconic visuals in manga history. But the plotting, particularly in later arcs, shows clear signs of improvisation. The full Bring arc was reportedly added because Kubo needed more time to set up the final arc. The 1,000-year Blood War, while visually stunning, has pacing issues that suggest editorial pressure and uncertain planning. Major plot threads were introduced and abandoned. Character motivations shifted without clear explanation. The ending felt rushed because it literally was rushed, with Kubo dealing with health issues and editorial demands that prevented him from executing his full vision. I'm not blaming Kubo for this. Weekly serialization is brutal, and not every creator can maintain the kind of infrastructure Oda has built. But the contrast is instructive. Bleach doesn't have foreshadowing that spans decades. It has cool moments that sometimes connect to earlier cool moments, but the connections feel more opportunistic than planned. When a reveal in Bleach links to something from earlier, it often feels like Kubo found a clever way to tie threads together, rather than having woven those threads intentionally from the start. Again, this isn't a criticism of Kubo's talent. It's an observation about methodology. Different creators work differently, and Kubo's strengths lie elsewhere. Fairy Tail is an interesting case, because Hiro Mashima is incredibly productive and clearly loves his work, but foreshadowing has never been the series' strength. Fairy Tail operates on the power of friendship and emotional spectacle. Characters win fights through determination and bonds rather than through clever use of established power systems. The world building is loose enough that Mashima can introduce new elements whenever the story needs them. This isn't a flaw if you're reading Fairy Tail for what it's good at. It's fun. It's earnest. It's emotionally satisfying in a straightforward way. But it's not trying to be what One Piece is trying to be. Mashima isn't playing the long game of foreshadowing because that's not the game he's interested in playing. Hunter x Hunter is the closest comparison to One Piece in terms of ambition, and it's worth examining why it still doesn't quite reach the same level of foreshadowing density. Yoshihiro Togashi is a genius, there's no other word for it. Hunter x Hunter has some of the most intricate plotting, the most sophisticated power systems, and the most morally complex storytelling in all of manga. Togashi thinks several steps ahead. He plants information that pays off beautifully. The Chimera Ant arc is a masterpiece of long-form narrative construction. But Hunter x Hunter has a problem that One Piece doesn't. It stops. Togashi's health issues have resulted in years-long hiatuses that break the continuity of reading experience. Fans wait years between chapters. The story advances in bursts separated by long silences. And while Togashi clearly has a plan, the execution of that plan is fragmented by circumstances beyond his control. You can't build the same kind of foreshadowing momentum when your series is on hiatus more often than it's running. Togashi might be as meticulous as Oda in his planning, but he hasn't had the opportunity to demonstrate it across an unbroken 27-year run. There's also a density question. Hunter x Hunter is a shorter work than One Piece. It has fewer chapters, fewer characters, fewer locations, fewer concurrent plot threads. This isn't a criticism. Togashi is telling a different kind of story, at a different scale. But it means the potential for long-range foreshadowing is necessarily smaller. When your series is 400 chapters, your longest setup to payoff gaps can only be so long. One Piece has had the time, the space, and the consistency to plant setups that span nearly 1,000 chapters. That's a luxury of longevity that few series achieve and even fewer use well. So what's the actual claim I'm making here? It's not that One Piece is the best manga. That's a subjective judgment that depends on what you value in fiction. It's not that other manga are bad at foreshadowing. Many of them are quite good at it within the parameters they've set for themselves. The claim is narrower and more specific. One Piece has the highest density of long-range intentional foreshadowing of any manga in the medium's history. The ratio of setups to payoffs measured across chapter distance is unmatched. The consistency of that foreshadowing, maintained across decades without contradiction, is unmatched. The scale of the narrative architecture, the number of threads being tracked simultaneously, is unmatched. This isn't Oda being smarter than other mangaka. It's Oda working differently. He built systems that other creators didn't build. He made choices about planning and documentation that other creators didn't make. He prioritized long-term coherence in ways that required sacrifices elsewhere. The result is a body of work that does something no other manga has done at this scale. That's not bias, that's measurement. And if you don't believe me, try to find another example. Try to find another manga with foreshadowing that spans 17 years like the Nika silhouettes. Try to find another manga that planted a character's secret identity 15 years before the reveal like Sanji's lineage. Try to find another manga where the protagonist's true nature was hidden for over 1,000 chapters like Luffy's devil fruit. You won't find it. Because it doesn't exist. One Piece stands alone. Let's acknowledge the elephant in the room. One Piece is in its final saga. Oda has said this. The announcement came and the fandom collectively held its breath, because final saga means the end is coming. Not tomorrow, not next year, but within a time frame that's actually conceivable now. After spending most of our lives with this story, many of us are going to see it end. And that's terrifying. Not because we don't want conclusions. Conclusions are necessary. Stories need endings. But because we've invested so much, because Oda has built something so intricate, because the expectations are so impossibly high, there's a very real fear that the ending won't live up to what came before. I need to talk about Game of Thrones, and I apologize in advance, because I know this comparison has been done to death. But it's relevant precisely because it's become the cultural shorthand for brilliant setup, catastrophic payoff. Game of Thrones spent years building one of the most compelling fantasy narratives in television history. It had intricate political maneuvering. It had consequences for actions. It had foreshadowing that fans obsessively tracked and theorized about. And then the final season happened, and all of that careful construction was thrown out the window in favor of rushed conclusions that didn't earn their emotional weight. Characters acted inconsistently. Plot threads were abandoned. Prophecies that had been building for years were ignored or subverted in ways that felt like betrayal rather than surprise. The ending didn't just disappoint. It retroactively damaged the entire series. People stopped rewatching. People stopped recommending it to friends. A cultural phenomenon evaporated because the conclusion failed to honor what came before.
One Piece fans are haunted by this. We've seen what happens when a long-running story doesn't stick the landing. We know that all the brilliant foreshadowing, all the meticulous planning, all the decades of careful setup can be undone by an ending that doesn't deliver. And the fear is that Oda, despite everything, might not be able to pull it off. Not because he's not talented, not because he's not planning, but because the scale of what he's attempting might simply be beyond what any human being can execute. Let's do some math, because the math is daunting. We've identified in this video alone dozens of unresolved plot threads. The Void Century, the Will of D.I.M. and the Empty Throne, the National Treasure, the One Piece itself, the All Blue, the Moon Civilization, Vegapunk's broadcast and its aftermath, Shanks' true nature, the Revolutionary Army's plans, the final war that's been foreshadowed since Marineford, the destruction of Fishman Island that Shy Ali prophesied, the ancient weapons and their role in what's coming, Laugh Tale and what the Roger Pirates found there, the meaning of the century the world government erased. Each of these threads needs resolution. Each of them has been building for years, sometimes decades. And Oda needs to pay all of them off in a way that feels earned, that doesn't contradict what came before, that provides emotional satisfaction after 27 years of anticipation. That's not just difficult. That's a logistical nightmare. Every resolved thread takes chapters. Every payoff needs setup within the final saga to land properly. The pacing has to balance revelation with action, with character moments, with the 1,000 other demands of concluding an epic. And Oda is still working on a weekly schedule, still managing his health, still dealing with the brutal reality of serialization. The final saga isn't being written in a vacuum. It's being produced under the same conditions that have always applied, except now the stakes are higher than they've ever been. There's also the problem of expectations. When you spend 27 years building anticipation, you create expectations that might be impossible to meet. The One Piece, the actual treasure at the end of the Grand Line, has been the central mystery of the series since Chapter 1. Fans have been theorizing about what it is for longer than some of them have been alive. Whatever Oda reveals, some portion of the fanbase will be disappointed. That's inevitable. The treasure can't be everything to everyone. It can't satisfy every theory, every headcanon, every dream that readers have projected onto this mystery. Oda has to make a choice about what the One Piece is, and that choice will necessarily exclude other possibilities. The same applies to every major reveal. The Void Century will have a specific answer. The D will have a specific meaning. And those specific answers will be compared against decades of speculation, much of which will turn out to be wrong. I'm not saying this to be pessimistic. I'm saying this because I think it's important to have realistic expectations going into the finale. One Piece's ending is not going to be perfect. It can't be perfect. Perfection isn't possible when you're trying to conclude something this large and this beloved. There will be threads that don't get the attention fans think they deserve. There will be payoffs that land differently than people expected. There will be moments that feel rushed because there's only so much time and so many pages. That's the reality of ending any long-running story, and One Piece is longer running than almost anything. But here's why I still have hope. Here's why I don't think One Piece is heading toward a Game of Thrones situation. The difference is planning. The showrunners of Game of Thrones were working from incomplete source material and admitted they didn't know how to end the story. They ran out of runway. They didn't have the answers because George R.R. Martin hadn't provided them. Oda has the answers. Oda has always had the answers. Everything we've discussed in this video points to a creator who knows where he's going. The foreshadowing doesn't work if you don't know the destination. The consistency doesn't happen if you're improvising. Oda has spent 27 years demonstrating that he has a plan, and there's no evidence that plan has changed or been lost. Oda has also said repeatedly that he's been looking forward to the ending. He's talked about it in interviews with genuine excitement.
He's mentioned that the final reveals are things he's been waiting to draw for decades. This isn't a creator who's dreading the conclusion or who's unsure how to wrap things up. This is a creator who has been building toward a specific endpoint and is finally approaching the moment where he gets to deliver it. That energy matters. That confidence matters. When a storyteller knows their ending and is excited to share it, that usually shows in the final product. I can't promise the ending will satisfy everyone. I can't promise Oda will stick the landing perfectly. But I can promise that if anyone can do it, it's the person who's demonstrated more long-range narrative planning than any other manga creator in history. The receipts are there, the track record is there. Every payoff we've examined suggests Oda knows what he's doing. The final saga is the ultimate test of everything he's built. And while I'm nervous, while I'm anxious, while I'm terrified of disappointment, I'm also hopeful. Because Oda has earned that hope. He's earned it over 1,000 chapters. And I'm choosing to trust that the same planning that made all this foreshadowing possible will carry through to the end. Ask me again in 5 years whether that trust was justified. We started this video with a conversation about the word foreshadowing. I told you that the community had lost the plot on what this term actually means, that we needed to distinguish between foreshadowing, retrofitting, and what I called prewriting. And now, after everything we've examined, I want to return to that distinction, because I think we've proven something. One Piece isn't a story that uses foreshadowing in the traditional sense. One Piece is a pre-written narrative being revealed in serialized form. The difference matters. The difference is everything. Traditional foreshadowing is reactive in some sense. You plant seeds because you have a general idea of where the story might go, and later you harvest whatever grew. Sometimes you plan the harvest. Sometimes you look at what sprouted and decide to use it. The skill is in making the connection feel intentional, regardless of how much was actually planned. This is how most serialized fiction works, and there's nothing wrong with it. It produces great stories. It allows for flexibility and adaptation. It lets creators respond to their audience and adjust their narratives based on what's working. Oda doesn't do this. Oda decided, before Chapter 1 ever published, where this story was going to end. He decided who the major players would be. He decided what the reveals would be. He decided what the One Piece was, what the Void Century contained, what the Will of D meant, who Joy Boy was, what Luffy would become. And then he started drawing. Every chapter since then has been connecting the present to a fixed future. Every detail has been load-bearing in some way, either directly setting up a planned reveal or building the world in which that reveal will make sense. The foreshadowing doesn't feel intentional because Oda is skilled at making connections. It feels intentional because it is intentional. Because everything was always intentional. This is genuinely unprecedented in the medium. Other mangaka have plans, other mangaka know their endings, but no one else has maintained this level of consistency across this many chapters for this many years. No one else has planted details in 1999 that paid off in 2022. No one else has hidden a protagonist's true nature for over 1,000 chapters while leaving clues visible the entire time. Oda isn't operating at the far end of the normal distribution for manga planning. He's operating in a category that didn't exist before he created it. He defined a new ceiling for what long-form serialized storytelling can achieve. And here's what I think that means for the medium as a whole. One Piece is a proof of concept. It demonstrates that you can tell a story across decades without losing coherence. It proves that weekly serialization doesn't have to mean reactive writing. It shows that a single creator, with sufficient planning and documentation and sheer stubborn determination, can build something on a scale that seems impossible. This doesn't mean every manga should try to be One Piece. Different stories have different needs, but it does mean that the ceiling is higher than anyone thought. If you want to tell a story that spans generations, that rewards obsessive rereading, that treats every detail as potentially significant, One Piece proves it can be done. Oda walked the path first. Others can follow if they're willing to put in the infrastructure. There's something almost absurd about what Oda has accomplished. He's been drawing the same story since 1997. He's been maintaining the same narrative threads since the Clinton administration. Kids who started reading One Piece in middle school now have kids of their own who are reading One Piece. The story has outlasted careers, relationships, entire eras of human history. And through all of that, through health scares and hiatuses and the grinding brutality of weekly serialization, Oda has kept the threads intact. He hasn't lost the plot. He hasn't forgotten what he set up. He hasn't contradicted his own world building in ways that matter. The story that began in 1997 is recognizably the same story being told today, just further along in its execution. I don't know if we'll ever see anything like this again. The conditions that made One Piece possible might be unique. You need a creator with Oda's specific combination of talents, the artistic ability to draw compelling manga week after week, the narrative vision to conceive of a story this large, the organizational discipline to document and track thousands of details across decades, the physical and mental endurance to maintain a schedule that would break most people, the editorial support to execute the vision without interference, the audience loyalty to sustain a story this long without it being cancelled or pressured into a rushed conclusion. All of these factors had to align, and they did, and the result is One Piece. Even if the ending disappoints some people, even if every thread doesn't get paid off perfectly, the legacy is secure. Oda has already proven what he set out to prove. He's already demonstrated that pre-written serialization at this scale is possible. The receipts we examine today aren't just impressive moments in a manga. They're evidence of a new storytelling methodology. They're proof that you can hide a prince for 15 years, that you can plant a skeleton's whale 400 chapters early, that you can draw a god 17 years before revealing what you drew, that you can build a world so comprehensive, so detailed, so internally consistent that fans can spend decades analyzing it and still find new connections. One Piece changed me. I know that sounds dramatic. I know that sounds like the kind of thing people say in video essays to manufacture emotional beats. But it's true. This story has been part of my life for longer than most things. Analyzing it has taught me how to think about narrative structure, about long-term planning, about the relationship between setup and payoff. It's shown me what obsessive craftsmanship looks like in practice. It's proven that caring about details, about consistency, about treating your audience's intelligence with respect actually matters. That you can build something meaningful if you're willing to put in the work over decades rather than looking for shortcuts. I don't know what comes next. I don't know exactly how Oda will resolve the threads we've discussed. I don't know whether the ending will satisfy me or frustrate me or leave me somewhere in between. But I know this. Whatever happens, I'm grateful for the journey. I'm grateful for the opportunity to spend 2.5 hours walking through the evidence of one man's impossible achievement. I'm grateful for the receipts. I'm grateful for the whale and the skeleton and the prince and the god and the samurai who hated dragons. I'm grateful for every panel that turned out to be set up for something I didn't see coming. I'm grateful for fictional pirate creator man and his filing cabinets full of secrets. We started by asking what foreshadowing really means. We end having answered a bigger question. What does it mean to tell a story that spans a generation? What does it mean to plant seeds before your readers are born and harvest them when they're adults? What does it mean to pre-write a narrative so thoroughly that every chapter is both a present moment and a piece of a puzzle that was completed before any of us knew it existed? It means One Piece. It means 27 years and counting. It means the greatest long-form narrative achievement in the history of manga, and I will die on that hill. The foreshadowing isn't just good. It's not just impressive. It's proof that Eiichiro Oda played a game none of us even knew we were part of. And we've been losing beautifully ever since Chapter 1. But you let me know what you think in the comments. And please do subscribe to this channel for consistent injections of One Piece culture administered directly into your YouTube feed.